Enchanters End Game, Book 5 of the Belgariad, by David Eddings. Prologue. Being an account of beginnings and endings. Excerpts from the Book of Torak. Editor's note. This version, said to be from the dread Book of Torak, is one of several circulated among the Nadraks. Since only the high Grolums were permitted official copies of the work, it is impossible to establish that this version is authentic, though internal evidence suggests that much of it may be. A true copy of the complete Book of Torak is believed to be in the library of King Anheg of Kerek, but this was not available for comparison. Hear me, ye Angaraks, for I am Torak, Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Bow before my name, and worship me with prayers, and with sacrifices. For I am your God, and I have dominion over all of the realms of the Angaraks. And great shall be my wrath if ye displease me. I was before the world was made. I shall be after the mountains crumble into sand, the seas dwindle to stagnant pools, and the world shrivels and is no more. For I was before time, and shall be after. From the timeless reaches of infinity, I gazed upon the future, and I beheld that there were two destinies, and that they must rush toward each other from the endless corridors of eternity. Each destiny was absolute, and in that final meeting, all that was divided should be made one. In that instant, all that was, all that is, and all that was yet to be, should be gathered into one purpose. And because of my vision, I led my 6 brothers to join hands to make all that is, in fulfillment of the needs of the destinies. Thus we set the moon and the sun in their courses, and we brought forth this world. We covered the world with forests and grasses, and made beasts, fowls, and fishes to fill the lands and skies and waters which we had made. But our Father took no joy in this creation which I had caused to be. He turned his face from our labor to contemplate the Absolute. I went alone into the high places of Kurim, which are no more, and I cried out to him to accept what I had made. But he rejected the work I had caused to be, and turned from me. Then I hardened my heart against him, and went down from that place, fatherless, evermore. Once more I counseled my brothers, and we joined our hands and brought forth man to be the instrument of our will. We created man as many peoples, and to each people we gave a choice to select among us the one who should be their God. And the peoples chose from us, save only that no people chose Aldur, who was ever contrary and discontented that we would not grant him dominion. Then Aldur withdrew himself from among us, and sought to entice our servants away from us with enchantments. But few were they who accepted him. The peoples who were mine called themselves the Angaraks. I was well pleased with them, and I led them to the high places of Kurim, which are no more. And to them I revealed the nature of the purpose for which I had caused the world to be. Then they worshipped me with prayers, and offered burnt offerings unto me. And I blessed them, and they prospered and grew numerous. In their gratitude they raised up an altar to me, and there made sacrifice to me of their fairest maidens, and a portion of their bravest youths. And I was well pleased with them, and again I blessed them, so that they prospered above all other men, and multiplied exceedingly. Now The heart of Aldur was filled with envy for the worship that was given to me, and he was driven with despite for me. Then did he conspire against me within the secret places of his soul, and he took up a stone, and breathed life into it, that it might thwart my purpose. And in that stone he sought to gain dominion over me. Thus Thragyaska came to be. And there was eternal enmity sealed within Thragyaska against me. And Aldur set apart with those whom he called his disciples, and plotted how the stone should give him dominion. I saw that the accursed stone had divided Aldur from me, and from his brothers. And I went to Aldur, and remonstrated with him, begging that he lift the wicked enchantment from the stone, and take back the life he had breathed into it. This I did that Aldur might no longer be divided from his brothers. Yea, I did even weep and abase myself before him. But already the evil stone had gained possession over the soul of Aldur, and he had hardened his heart against me. And I saw then that the stone which Aldur had created would forever hold my brother in thraldom. And he spoke slightingly to me, and would have driven me forth. Then for the love I bore him, and to save him from the evil course which my vision revealed, I struck my brother Aldur down, and took from him the accursed rock. And I bore Thragyaska away, to bend my will upon it, and to still the malice within it, and quell the wickedness for which it was created. And so it was that I took the burden of the thing which Aldur had created upon myself. Aldur was wroth with me. He went to our brothers and spoke to them falsely against me. And each of them came to me and spoke slightingly to me, commanding that I return to Aldur that which had twisted his soul, and which I had taken to free him from the enchantment of it. But I resisted. Then they girded for war. The sky was blackened with the smoke of their forges, as their peoples beat out weapons of iron to spill the blood of my Angarax upon the ground. When the year turned, their hosts marched forth, and on to the lands of the Angarax. And my brothers loomed tall in the forefront of the hosts. Now was I greatly loath to lift my hand against them. Yet I could not permit that they should despoil the lands of my people, or loose the blood of those who worshipped me. And I knew that from such war between my brothers and me could come only evil. In that struggle the destinies I had seen might be sent against each other before it was time, and the universe be shaken apart in that meeting. And so I chose that which I feared, but which was less evil than the danger I foresaw. I took up the accursed Thragyaska, and raised it against the earth itself. And in me lay the purpose of one destiny, while the purpose of the other was affixed within the stone Aldur had created. The weight of all that was or will be was upon us, and the earth could not bear our weight. Then did her mantle rend asunder before me, and the sea rushed in to drown the dry land. Thus were the people separated one from the other, that they might not come upon each other, and their blood be spilled. But such was the malice which Aldur had wrought within the stone, that it smote me with fire as I raised it to divide the world, and prevent evil bloodshed. Even as I spoke the commands unto it, it burst into dreadful fire, and smote me. The hand with which I held it was consumed, and the eye with which I beheld it was blinded. One half of my face was marred by its burning, and I, who had been the fairest among my brothers, was now abhorrent to the eyes of all, and I must cover my face with a living mask of steel, lest they shun me. An agony filled me from the evil that was done to me, and pain lived within me, which could never be quenched until the foul stone could be freed of its evil and could repent of its malice. But the dark sea stood between my people and those who would come against them, and my enemies fled in terror of that which I had done. Yea, even my brothers fled from the world which we had made, for they dared no longer come against me. Yet still did they conspire with their followers in spirit form. Then I bore my people away to the wastelands of Meloria, and there caused them to build a mighty city on a sheltered place. They named it Mishrak, as a remembrance of the suffering that I had undergone for them. And I concealed their city with a cloud that should ever be above it. Then I had a cask of iron forged, and in it I bound Chragyaska, that the evil stone should never again be free to unleash its power to destroy flesh. For 1,000 years, and still another 1,000 years, I labored, contending with the stone that I might release the curse of malice which Aldur had laid upon it. Great were the enchantments and words of power which I cast at the obdurate stone, but still its evil fire burned when I came near to it, and I felt its curse lying ever upon the world. Then Belar, youngest and most rash of my brothers, conspired against me with Aldur, who still bore hatred and jealousy within his soul toward me. And Belar spoke in spirit to his uncouth people, the Aelorns, and set them against me. The spirit of Aldur sent Belgariad, the disciple in whom he had most wholly instilled his despite, to join with them. And the foul counsel of Belgariad prevailed upon Kerak, chief of the Aelorns, and upon his 3 sons. By evil sorcery, they passed the barrier of the sea I had caused to be, and they came like thieves in the night to the city of Mishrak. By stealth and low cunning, they crept through my tower of iron, and made their way to the chest that held the evil stone. The youngest son of Kerak, whom men called Riva, Iron Grip, had been so woven about with spells and enchantments that he could take up the accursed stone and not perish, and they fled with it to the west. With the warriors of my people I pursued them, that the curse of Chragyaska not again be loosed upon the land. But the one called Riva raised the stone and loosed its evil fire upon my people. Thus the thieves escaped, bearing the evil of the stone with them into their lands of the west. Then I pulled down the mighty city of Mishrak, that my people must flee from its ruins. And I divided the Angaraks into tribes. The Nadraks I set in the north to guard the ways in which the thieves had come. The Tulls, broad of back for the bearing of burdens, I set in the middle lands. The Murgos, fiercest of my people, I sent to the south. And the most numerous I kept with me in Meloria, to serve me, and to multiply against a day when I should have need of an army against the west. Above all of these peoples I set the Grolums, and instructed them in enchantments and wizardry, that they be a priesthood to me, and watch over the zeal of all the others. And them I instructed to keep my altars burning, and to be unceasing in their sacrifices to me. Belgariad, in his wickedness, had sent Riva with the accursed stone to rule an island in the Sea of Winds. And there Belar caused 2 stars to fall to the earth. From these Riva forged a sword, and set Chragyaska into its pommel. And when Riva gripped that sword, the universe shuddered about me, and I cried out, for my vision had opened to me, revealing much that had been hidden before. I saw that Belgariad's sorceress daughter should in time be my bride, and I rejoiced. But I also saw that a child of light would descend from Riva's loins, and he would be an instrument of that destiny which opposed that other destiny which gave me my purpose. Then would come a day when I must wake from some long sleep to face the sword of the child of light. And upon that day, the two destinies would clash, with only one victor alive, and one destiny thenceforth. But which was not revealed. Long I pondered this vision, but no more was revealed, and 1,000 years passed, and even more. Then I called to me Zadar, a wise and just man, who had fled from the malice of Aldur's teachings, and had come unto me with an offer of service. And I sent him to the court of the serpent people, who dwelt among the swamps in the west. Their god was Issa, but he was ever lazy, and he slept, leaving the people who called themselves Naisans to the sole rule of their queen. And to her Zadar did make certain offers, which were pleasing to her. And she sent her assassins as emissaries to the court of Riva's descendants. There did they slay all of that line, save only one child who chose to drown himself in the sea. Thus did the vision err. For what child of light can be born, when none remain to bear him? And thus have I assured that my purpose shall be served, and that the evil of Aldur and his brothers shall not destroy the world which I caused to be created. The kingdoms of the west, which have hearkened unto the counsel and beguilements of wicked gods and evil sorcerers, will be brought unto the dust, and I will harry those who sought to deny me and confound me, and multiply their suffering. And they shall be brought low, and they shall fall before me, offering themselves as a sacrifice upon my altars. And the time shall come, when I have lordship and dominion over all the earth, and all peoples shall be mine. Hear me, ye peoples, and fear me. Bow down before me and worship me. For I am Torak, forever King of kings, Lord of lords, and God alone to this world, which I have caused to be. Part 1. Gar Og Nadrak. Chapter 1. There was, Garion decided, something definitely mournful about the sound of mule bells. The mule was not a particularly lovable animal to begin with, and there was a subtle difference to his gait that imparted a lugubrious note to a bell hung about his neck. The mules were the property of a Drasnian merchant named Mulgar, a lanky, hard-eyed man in a green doublet who, for a price, had allowed Garion, Silk, and Belgariad to accompany him on his trek into Gar Og Nadrak. Mulgar's mules were laden with trade goods, and Mulgar himself seemed to carry a burden of preconceptions and prejudices almost as heavy as a fully loaded mule pack. Silk and the worthy merchant had disliked each other at first sight, and Silk amused himself by baiting his countrymen as they rode eastward across the rolling moors toward the jagged peaks that marked the boundary between Drasnia and the land of the Nadraks. Their discussions, hovering just on the verge of wrangling, grated on Garion's nerves almost as much as the tiresome clanging of the bells on Mulgar's mules. Garion's edginess at this particular time came from a very specific source. He was afraid. There was no point in trying to conceal that fact from himself. The cryptic words of the Mrin Codex had been explained to him in precise detail. He was riding toward a meeting that had been ordained since the beginning of time, and there was absolutely no way that he could avoid it. The meeting was the end result of not one, but 2 different prophecies, and even if he could persuade one of them that there had been a mistake someplace, the other would drive him to the confrontation without mercy or the slightest consideration for his personal feelings. "I think that you are missing the point, Ambar," Mulgar was saying to Silk with that kind of acid precision some men use when talking to someone they truly despise. "My patriotism or lack of it has nothing to do with the matter. The well-being of Drasnia depends upon trade. And if you people in the Foreign Service keep hiding your activities by posing as merchants, it won't be long before an honest Drasnian isn't welcome anywhere." Mulgar, with that instinct that seemed inborn in all Drasnians, had instantly recognized the fact that Silk was not what he pretended to be. "Oh, come now, Mulgar," Silk replied with an airy condescension. "Don't be so naive. Every kingdom in the world conceals its intelligence activities in exactly the same way. The Tonedrons do it, the Murgos do it, even the Tulls do it. What do you want me to do? Walk around with a sign on my chest reading spy?" "Frankly, Ambar, I don't care what you do," Mulgar retorted, his lean face hardening. "All I can say is that I'm getting very tired of being watched every place I go, just because you people can't be trusted." Silk shrugged with an impudent grin. "It is the way the world is, Mulgar. You might as well get used to it, because it is not going to change." Mulgar glared at the rat-faced little man helplessly, then turned abruptly and rode back to keep company with his mules. "Aren't you pushing it just a little?" Belgarath suggested, lifting his head from the apparent doze in which he usually rode. "If you irritate him enough, he'll denounce you to the border guards, and we'll never get into Gar Og Nadrak." "Mulgar's not going to say a word, old friend," Silk assured him. "If he does, he will be held for investigation, and there is not a merchant alive who doesn't have a few things concealed in his packs that aren't supposed to be there." "Why don't you just leave him alone?" Belgarath asked. "It gives me something to do," Silk replied with a shrug. "Otherwise, I'd have to look at the scenery, and Eastern Drasnia bores me." Belgarath grunted sourly, pulling his gray hood up over his head and settled back into his nap. Gerion returned to his melancholy thoughts. The gorse bushes which covered the rolling moors had a depressing gray-green color to them, and the north caravan route wound like a dusty white scar across them. The sky had been overcast for nearly 2 weeks now, though there was no hint of moisture in the clouds. They plodded along through a dreary, shadowless world toward the stark mountains looming on the horizon ahead. It was the unfairness of it all that upset Gerion the most. He had never asked for any of this. He did not want to be a sorcerer. He did not want to be the Riven King. He was not even sure that he really wanted to marry Princess Genedra, although he was of 2 minds about that. The little imperial princess could be, usually when she wanted something, absolutely adorable. Most of the time, however, she did not want anything, and her true nature emerged. If he had consciously sought any of this, he could have accepted the duty which lay on him with a certain amount of resignation. He had been given no choice in the matter, though, and he found himself wanting to demand of the uncaring sky, "Why me?" He rode on beside his dozing grandfather with only the murmuring song of the orb of Aldur for company, and even that was a source of irritation. The orb, which stood on the pommel of the great sword strapped to his back, sang to him endlessly with a kind of silly enthusiasm. It might be all very well for the orb to exult about the impending meeting with Torak, but it was Geryon who was going to have to face the dragon god of Angarak, and it was Geryon who was going to have to do all of the bleeding. He felt that the unrelieved cheerfulness of the orb was, all things considered, in very poor taste, to say the least. The border between Drasnia and Gar Og Nadrak straddled the north caravan route in a narrow, rocky gap where two garrisons, one Drasnian and one Nadrak, faced each other across a simple gate that consisted of a single horizontal pole. By itself, the pole was an insubstantial barrier. Symbolically, however, it was more intimidating than the gates of Vomimbre or Tol Hunath. On one side of the gate stood the west, on the other, the east. With a single step, one could move from one world into a totally different one, and Geryon wished with all of his being that he did not have to take that step. As Sulk had predicted, Mulgar said nothing about his suspicions to either the Drasnian pikemen or the leather-clad Nadrak soldiers at the border, and they passed without incident into the mountains of Gar Og Nadrak. Once it passed the border, the caravan route climbed steeply up a narrow gorge beside a swiftly tumbling mountain stream. The rock walls of the gorge were sheer, black, and oppressive. The sky overhead narrowed to a dirty gray ribbon, and the clanging mule bells echoed back from the rocks to accompany the rush and pounding gurgle of the stream. Belgarath awoke and looked around, his eyes alert. He gave Silk a quick, sidelong glance that cautioned the little man to keep his mouth shut, then cleared his throat.
"We want to thank you, worthy Mulgar, and to wish you good luck in your dealings here."
Mulgar looked at the old sorcerer sharply, his eyes questioning.
"We'll be leaving you at the head of this gorge," Belgarath continued smoothly, his face bland. "Our business is off that way." He gestured rather vaguely.
Mulgar grunted.
"I don't want to know anything about it," he declared.
"You don't, really,"
Belgarath assured him.
"And please, don't take Ambar's remarks too seriously. He has a comic turn of mind, and he says things he does not always mean, because he enjoys irritating people. Once you get to know him, he's not quite so bad."
Mulgar gave Silk a long, hard look and let it pass without comment.
Good luck in whatever it is you're doing," he said grudgingly, forced to say it more out of courtesy than out of any genuine good feeling. "You and the young man were not bad traveling companions."
"We're in your debt, worthy Mulgar," Silk added with mocking extravagance. "Your hospitality has been exquisite." Mulgar looked directly at Silk again.
"I don't really like you, Ambar," he said bluntly. "Why don't we just let it go at that?"
"I'm crushed," Silk grinned at him.
"Let it lie,"
Belgarath growled. "I made every effort to win him over," Silk protested. Belgarath turned his back on him. "I really did," Silk appealed to Geryon, his eyes brimming with mock sincerity. "I don't believe you either," Geryon told him. Silk sighed.
"Oh, nobody understands me,"
he complained. Then he laughed and rode on up the gorge, whistling happily to himself. At the head of the gorge, they left Mulgar and struck off to the left of the caravan route through a jumble of rock and stunted trees. At the crest of a stony ridge, they stopped to watch the slow progress of the mules until they were out of sight. "Where are we headed?" Silk asked, squinting up at the clouds scudding past overhead. "I thought that we were going to Yargaruk."
"We are," Belgarath replied, scratching at his beard. "But we will circle around and come at the town from the other side. Mulgar's opinions make traveling with him just a bit chancy. He might let slip something at the wrong time. Besides, Garion and I have something to take care of before we get there."
The old man looked around.
"Over there ought to do,"
he said, pointing at a shallow green dale, concealed on the far side of the ridge. He led them down into the dale and dismounted. Silk, leading their single pack-horse, pulled up beside a small pool of spring water and tied the horses to a dead snag standing at its edge. "What is it that we have to do, grandfather?" Garion asked, sliding out of his saddle.
"That sword of yours is a trifle obvious," the old man told him. "Unless we want to spend the whole trip answering questions, we're going to have to do something about it."
"Are you going to make it invisible?" Silk asked hopefully.
"Well, in a manner of speaking," Belgarath answered. "Open your mind to the orb, Garion. Just let it talk to you."
Garion frowned. "I don't understand."
"Just relax. The orb will do the rest. It's very excited about you, so don't pay too much attention to it if it starts making suggestions. It has a severely limited understanding of the real world. Just relax. Let your mind sort of drift. I have got to talk to it. And I can only do that through you. It won't listen to anyone else."
Garion leaned back against a tree. In a moment he found his mind filled with all manner of peculiar images. The world he perceived in that imagining was tinged over with a faint blue haze, and everything seemed angular, as if constructed out of the flat planes and sharp edges of a crystal. He caught a vivid picture of himself, flaming sword in hand, riding at great speed with whole hordes of faceless men fleeing out of his path. Belgarath's voice sounded sharply in his mind then.
"Stop that!"
The words, he realized, were not directed at him, but instead at the orb itself. Then the old man's voice dropped to a murmur, instructing, explaining something. The responses of that other, crystalline awareness seemed a trifle petulant, but eventually there seemed to be an agreement of some kind, and then Garion's mind cleared. Belgarath was shaking his head with a rueful expression.
"It's almost like talking to a child sometimes. It has no conception of numbers. It can't even begin to comprehend the meaning of the word danger."
"It is still there," Silk noted, sounding a bit disappointed. "I can still see the sword."
"That's because you know it's there," Belgarath told him. "Other people will overlook it."
"How can you overlook something that big?" Silk objected.
"It's very complicated," Belgarath replied. "The orb is simply going to encourage people not to see it, or the sword. If they look very closely, they might realize that Garion's carrying something on his back, but they won't be curious enough about it to try to find out what it is. As a matter of fact, quite a few people won't even notice Garion himself."
"Are you trying to say that Garion is invisible?"
"No. He's just sort of unremarkable for the time being. Let's move on. Night comes on quickly up in these mountains."
Yargurak was perhaps the ugliest town Garion had ever seen. It was strung out on either side of a roiling yellow creek, and muddy, unpaved streets ran up the steep slopes of the cut the stream had gouged out of the hills. The sides of the cut beyond the town had been stripped of all vegetation. There were shafts running back into the hillsides and great rooted-out excavations. There were springs among the diggings, and they trickled muddy water down the slopes to pollute the creek. The town had a slapdash quality about it, and all of the buildings seemed somewhat temporary. Construction was, for the most part, log and uncut rock, and several of the houses had been finished off with canvas. The streets teemed with lanky, dark-faced Nadraks, many of whom were obviously drunk. A nasty brawl erupted out of a tavern door as they entered the town, and they were forced to stop, while perhaps 24 Nadraks rolled about in the mud, trying, with a fair amount of success, to incapacitate or even maim each other. The sun was going down as they found an inn at the end of a muddy street. It was a large, square building with the main floor constructed of stone, a second story built of logs, and stables attached to the rear. They put up their horses, took a room for the night, and then entered the barn-like common room in search of supper. The benches in the common room were a bit unsteady, and the tabletops were grease-smeared and littered with crumbs and spilled food. Oil lamps hung smoking on chains, and the smell of cooking cabbage was overpowering. A fair number of merchants from various parts of the world sat at their evening meal in the room, wary-eyed men in tight little groups with walls of suspicion drawn around them. Belgariad, Silk, and Geryon sat down at an unoccupied table and ate the stew brought to them in wooden bowls by a tipsy serving-man in a greasy apron. When they had finished, Silk glanced at the open doorway leading into the noisy tap-room, and then looked inquiringly at Belgariad. The old man shook his head.
"Better not. Nadraks are a high-strung people, and relations with the West are a little tense just now. There is no point in asking for trouble."
Silk nodded his glum agreement, and led the way up the stairs at the back of the inn to the room they had taken for the night. Geryon held up their guttering candle, and looked dubiously at the log-frame bunks standing against the walls of the room. The bunks had rope springs and mattresses stuffed with straw. They looked lumpy and not very clean. The noise from the tap-room below was loud and raucous. "I don't think we're going to get much sleep tonight."
"Mining towns are not like farm villages,"
Silk pointed out.
"Farmers feel the need for decorum, even when they are drunk. Miners tend on the whole to be somewhat rowdier."
Belgariad shrugged.
"Well, quiet down in a bit. Most of them will be unconscious long before midnight."
He turned to Silk.
"As soon as the shops open up in the morning, I want you to get us some different clothing, used, preferably. If we look like gold hunters, nobody's going to pay very much attention to us. Get a pick-handle and a couple of rock hammers. We'll tie them to the outside of the pack on our spare horse for show."
"I get a feeling that you have done this before."
"From time to time. It is a useful disguise. Gold hunters are crazy to begin with, so people are not surprised if they show up in strange places."
The old man laughed shortly.
"I even found gold once, a vein as thick as your arm."
Silk's face grew immediately intent.
"Where?"
Belgariad shrugged.
"Off that way somewhere," he replied with a vague gesture. "I forget exactly."
"Belgariad," Silk objected with a note of anguish in his voice.
"Don't get sidetracked," Belgariad told him. "Let's get some sleep. I want to be out of here as early as possible tomorrow morning."
The overcast, which had lingered for weeks, cleared off during the night. When Geryon awoke, the new-risen sun streamed golden through the dirty window. Belgariad was seated at the rough table on the far side of the room, studying a parchment map, and Silk had already left.
"I thought for a while that you were going to sleep past noon," the old man said as Geryon sat up and stretched.
"I had some trouble getting to sleep last night," Geryon replied. "It was a little noisy downstairs."
"Nadraks are like that."
A sudden thought occurred to Geryon. "What do you think Aunt Paul is doing just now?"
"Sleeping, probably."
"Not this late."
"It's much earlier where she is."
"I don't follow that."
"Riva's 1,500 leagues west of here," Belgariad explained. "The sun won't get that far for several hours yet."
Geryon blinked. "I hadn't thought of that," he admitted.
"I didn't think that you had."
The door opened, and Silk came in carrying several bundles and wearing an outraged expression. He threw his bundles down and stumped to the window, muttering curses under his breath.
"What has got you so worked up?" Belgarath asked mildly.
"Would you look at this?" Silk waved a piece of parchment at the old man.
"What's the problem?"
Belgarath took the parchment and read it. "That all business was settled years ago," Silk declared in an irritated voice. "Why are these things still being circulated?"
"This description is colorful," Belgarath noted.
"Did you see that?" Silk sounded mortally offended. He turned to Geryon. "Do I look like a weasel to you?"
"An ill-favored, weasel-faced man," Belgarath read, "shifty-eyed, and with a long-pointed nose, a notorious cheat at dice."
"Do you mind?" "What is this all about?" Geryon asked. "I had a slight misunderstanding with the authorities some years ago," Silk explained. "Nothing all that serious, actually. But they are still circulating that thing." He gestured angrily at the parchment that Belgarath was still reading, with an amused expression. "They've even gone so far as to offer a reward." He considered for a moment. "I'll have to admit the sum is flattering, though."
"Did you get the things I sent you after?" Belgarath asked.
"Of course."
"Let's change clothes, then, and leave before your unexpected celebrity attracts a crowd."
The worn Nadrak clothing was made mostly of leather, snug black trousers, tight-fitting vests, and short-sleeved linen tunics. "I did not bother with the boots," Silk said. "Nadrak boots are pretty uncomfortable, probably since it hasn't occurred to them yet that there's a difference between the right foot and the left." He settled a pointed felt cap at a jaunty angle. "What do you think?" he asked, striking a pose.
"Doesn't look at all like a weasel, does he?"
Belgarath asked Geryon. Silk gave him a disgusted look, but said nothing. They went downstairs, led their horses out of the stables attached to the inn, and mounted. Silk's expression remained sour as they rode out of Yargorok. When they reached the top of the hill to the north of the town, he slid off of his horse, picked up a rock, and threw it rather savagely at the buildings clustered below.
"Does that make you feel better?"
Belgarath asked curiously. Silk remounted with a disdainful sniff and led the way down the other side of the hill. Chapter 2. They rode for the next few days through a wilderness of stone and stunted trees. The sun grew warmer each day, and the sky overhead was intensely blue as they pressed deeper and deeper into the snow-capped mountains. There were trails of sorts up here, winding, vagrant tracks meandering between the dazzling white peaks and across the high, pale green meadows where wildflowers nodded in the mountain breeze. The air was spiced with the resinous odor of evergreen, and now and then they saw deer grazing or stopping to watch them with large, startled eyes as they passed. Belgarath moved confidently in a generally eastward course, and he appeared to be alert and watchful. There were no signs of the half-doze in which he customarily rode on more clearly defined roads, and he seemed somehow younger up here in the mountains. They encountered other travelers, leather-clad Nadraks for the most part, although they did see a party of Drasnians laboring up a steep slope and, once, a long way off, what appeared to be a Tolnedran. Their exchanges with these others were brief and wary. The mountains of Gar Og Nadrak were at best sketchily policed, and it was necessary for every man who entered them to provide for his own security. The sole exception to this suspicious taciturnity was a garrulous old gold hunter mounted on a donkey, who appeared out of the blue-tinged shadows under the trees one morning. His tangled hair was white, and his clothing was mismatched, appearing to consist mostly of cast-offs he had found beside this trail or that. His tanned, wrinkled face was weathered like a well-cured old hide, and his blue eyes twinkled merrily. He joined them without any greeting or hint of uncertainty as to his welcome, and began talking immediately as if taking up a conversation again that had only recently been interrupted. There was a sort of comic turn to his voice and manner that Geryon found immediately engaging. "Must be 10 years or more since I followed this path," he began, jouncing along on his donkey as he fell in beside Geryon. "I don't come down into this part of the mountains very much anymore. Stream beds down here have all been worked over 100 times at least. Which way you bound?" "I'm not really sure," Geryon replied cautiously. "I've never been up here before, so I'm just following along."
"You'd better find gravel if you struck out to the north," the man on the donkey advised. "Up near Morandland. Of course, you got to be careful up there. But, like they say, no risk, no profit."
He squinted curiously at Geryon.
"You're not a Nadrak, are you?"
"Sindar," Geryon responded shortly.
"Never been to Sindaria?" the old gold hunter mused. "Never been any place, really, except up here."
He looked around at the white-topped peaks and deep green forests with a sort of abiding love.
"Never really wanted to go any place. I've picked these mountains over from end to end for 70 years now. Never made much at it, except for the pleasure of being here. Found a river bar one time, though. Had so much red gold in it that it looked like it was bleeding. Winter caught me up there, and I almost froze to death trying to come out."
"Did you go back the next spring?" Geryon couldn't help asking.
Meant to. But I did a lot of drinking that winter. Had enough gold. Anyway, drink sort of addled my brains. When I set out the following year, I took along a few kegs for company. That's always a mistake. The drink takes you harder when you get up into the mountains, and you don't always pay attention to things the way you should."
He leaned back in his donkey saddle, scratching reflectively at his stomach.
"I went out onto the plains north of the mountains, up in Morandland. Seems that I thought at the time that the going might be easier out on flat ground. Well, to make it short, I ran across a band of Morindum, and they took me prisoner. I'd been up to my ears in an ale keg for a day or so, and I was far gone when they took me. Lucky, I guess. Morindum are superstitious, and they thought I was possessed. That's probably all that saved my life. They kept me for 5 or 6 years, trying to puzzle out the meaning behind my ravings. Once I got sober and saw the situation, it took quite a bit of care to do a lot of raving. Eventually they got tired of it, weren't so careful about watching me, so I escaped. By then I'd sort of forgotten exactly where that river was. I look for it now and then when I'm up that way."
His speech seemed rambling, but his old blue eyes were very penetrating.
"That's a big sword you're carrying, boy. Who do you plan to kill with it?"
The question came so fast that Geryon did not even have time to be startled.
"Funny thing about that sword of yours," the shabby old man added shrewdly. "Seems to be going out of its way to make itself inconspicuous."
Then he turned to Belgariad, who was looking at him with a level gaze.
"You haven't hardly changed at all," he noted.
"And you still talk too much," Belgariad replied.
"I get hungry for talk every few years," the old man on the donkey admitted. "Is your daughter well?"
Belgariad nodded.
"Fine-looking woman, your daughter. Bad-tempered, though."
"That hasn't changed noticeably."
"Didn't imagine it had."
The old gold hunter chuckled and then hesitated for a moment.
"If you don't mind some advice, be careful in case you plan to go down into the low country," he said seriously. "It looks like things might be coming to a boil down there. A lot of strangers in red tunics roaming about. There's been smoke coming up from the old altars that haven't been used in years. The grolums are out again. Knives are all new sharpened. The Nadraks who come up here keep looking back over their shoulders."
He paused then, looking directly at Belgariad.
"There have been some other signs, too," he added. "Animals are all jumpy." like just before a big storm. Sometimes at night, if you listen close, there's something like thunder way off in the distance, like maybe from as far off as Meloria. The whole world seems to be uneasy. I got a hunch that something pretty big's about to happen, maybe the sort of thing you'd be involved in. Now, the point is that they know you're out here. I wouldn't count too much on being able to slip through without somebody noticing you."
He shrugged then, as if washing his hands of the matter.
"I just thought you'd like to know."
"Thank you,"
Belgarath replied.
"It didn't cost me anything to say it." The old man shrugged again. "I think I'll go that way." He pointed off to the north. "Too many strangers coming into the mountains in the last few months. It's starting to get crowded. Well, I've about talked myself out now, so I think I'll go look myself up a bit of privacy."
He turned his donkey and trotted off.
"Good luck."
He threw back over his shoulder by way of farewell, and then disappeared into the blue shadows under the trees.
"You're acquainted with him, I take it,"
Silk observed to Belgarath. The old sorcerer nodded.
"I met him about 30 years ago. Polgara had come to Gar Og Nadrak to find out a few things. After she'd gathered all of the information she wanted, she sent word to me, and I came here and bought her from the man who owned her. We started home, but an early snowstorm caught us up here in the mountains. He found us floundering along, took us to the cave where he holes up when the snow gets too deep. Quite a comfortable cave, really, except that he insists on bringing his donkey inside. He and Paul argued about that all winter, as I recall."
"What is his name?" Silk asked curiously.
Belgarath shrugged. "He never said, and it's not polite to ask."
Garion, however, had choked on the word bought. A kind of helpless outrage welled up in him. "Somebody owned Aunt Paul?" he demanded incredulously.
"It is a Nadrak custom," Silk explained. "In their society, women are considered property. It's not seemly for a woman to go about without an owner."
"She was a slave?" Garion's knuckles grew white as he clenched his fists.
"Of course she wasn't a slave," Belgarath told him. "Can you even remotely imagine your aunt submitting to that sort of thing?"
"But you said—"
"I said I bought her from the man who owned her. Their relationship was a formality, nothing more. She needed an owner in order to function here, and he gained a great deal of respect from other men as a result of his ownership of so remarkable a woman."
Belgarath made a sour face.
"Cost me a fortune to buy her back from him. I sometimes wonder if she was really worth it."
"Grandfather!"
"I am sure she'd be fascinated by that last observation, old friend," Silk said slyly. "I don't know that it's necessary to repeat it to her, Silk."
"Oh, you'll never know," Silk laughed.
"I might need something from you someday." "That's disgusting."
"Oh, I know." Silk grinned and looked around.
"Your friend took quite a bit of trouble to look you up," he suggested.
"What was behind it?"
"He wanted to warn me."
"That things were tense in Gar Og Nadrak? We knew that already."
"His warning was a great deal more urgent than that."
"He didn't sound very urgent."
"That's because you don't know him."
"Grandfather," Garion said suddenly, "how did he manage to see my sword? I thought we had taken care of that."
"He sees everything, Garion. He could glance once at a tree and tell you 10 years later exactly how many leaves were on it."
"Is he a sorcerer?"
"Not as far as I know. He's just a strange old man who likes the mountains. He doesn't know what's going on because he doesn't want to know. If he really wanted to, he could probably find out everything that's happening in the world."
"He could make a fortune as a spy, then," Silk mused.
He doesn't want a fortune. Isn't that obvious? Any time he needs money, he just goes back to that river bar he mentioned."
"But he said he'd forgotten how to find it."
Belgarath snorted. "He's never forgotten anything in his life."
And then his eyes grew distant.
"There are a few people like him in the world. People who have no interest whatsoever in what other people are doing. Maybe that's not such a bad trait. If I had my life to live over, I might not mind doing it his way."
He looked around then, his eyes very alert.
"Let's take that path over there,"
he suggested, pointing at a scarcely visible track angling off across an open meadow, littered with bits of log bleached white by sun and weather.
"If what he says is true, I think we'll want to avoid any large settlements. That path comes out farther north, where there aren't so many people."
Not long afterward, the terrain began to slope downward, and the three of them moved along briskly, riding down out of the mountains toward the vastness of the forest of Nadrak. The peaks around them subsided into forested foothills. Once they topped a rise, they were able to look out at the ocean of trees lying below. The forest stretched to the horizon, and beyond, dark green beneath a blue sky. A faint breeze was blowing, and the sigh of its passage through the mile upon mile of trees below had a kind of endless sadness to it, a regretful memory of summers past and springs that would never come again. Some distance up the slope from the forest stood a village, huddled at the side of a vast open pit that had been gouged raw and ugly in the red dirt of the hillside.
"A mine town," Belgarath noted. "Let's nose about a bit and see what's going on."
They rode warily down the hill. As they drew closer, Garion could see that the village had that same temporary kind of appearance he had noticed about Gar Gorak. The buildings were constructed in the same way, unpeeled logs and rough stone, and the low-pitched roofs had large rocks laid on them to keep the shingles from blowing off during the winter blizzards. Nadraks seemed not to be concerned about the external appearance of their structures. Once the walls and roofs were completed, they appeared quite content to move in and devote their attention to other matters, without attending to those final finishing touches which gave a house that look of permanence that a Sindar or Tolnedrin would feel absolutely necessary. The entire settlement seemed to reflect an attitude of good enough that offended Garion for some reason. Some of the miners who lived in the village came out into the dirt streets to watch the strangers riding in. Their black leather clothing was stained red by the earth in which they dug, and their eyes were hard and suspicious. An air of fearful wariness hung over the whole place, seasoned with a touch of defiant bellicosity. Silk jerked his head toward a large, low building with a crude painting of a cluster of grapes on a sign banging in the breeze by the double doors at the front. A wide-roofed porch surrounded the building, and leather-garbed Nadraks lounged on benches along the porch, watching a dog-fight in progress out in the middle of the street.
Belgarath nodded. "But let's go around to the side, in case we have to leave in a hurry."
They dismounted at the side porch, tied their horses to the railing, and went inside. The interior of the tavern was smoky and dim, since windows seemed to be a rare feature in Nadrak buildings. The tables and benches were rough-hewn, and what light there was came from smoking oil lamps that hung on chains from the rafters. The floor was mud-stained and littered with bits of food. Dogs roamed at will under the tables and benches. The smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the air, and, though it was only early afternoon, the place was crowded. Many of the men in the large room were already far gone with drink. It was noisy, since the Nadraks lounging at the tables or stumbling about the room seemed all habitually to speak at the top of their voices. Belgarath pushed his way toward a table in the corner where a solitary man sat bleary-eyed and slack-lipped, staring into his ale-cup.
"You don't mind if we share the table, do you?"
the old man demanded of him in an abrupt manner, sitting down without awaiting a reply.
Would it do any good if I did? The man with the cup asked. He was unshaven, and his eyes were poochy and bloodshot. Not much, Belgariad told him bluntly. You're new here, aren't you? The Nadrak looked at the three of them with only a hint of curiosity, trying with some difficulty to focus his eyes. I don't really see that it's any of your business, Belgariad retorted rudely. You've got a sour mouth for a man past his prime, the Nadrak suggested, flexing his fingers ominously. I came here to drink, not fight, Silk declared in a harsh tone. I might change my mind later, but right now I'm thirsty. He reached out and caught the arm of a passing serving man. Ale, he ordered, and don't take all day. Keep your hands to yourself, the serving man told him. Are you with him? He pointed at the Nadrak they had joined. We're sitting with him, aren't we? You want 3 cups or 4? I want 1, for now. Bring the others what they want, too. I'll pay for the first round. The serving man grunted sourly and pushed his way off through the crowd, pausing long enough to kick a dog out of his way. Silk's offer seemed to quiet their Nadrak companions' belligerence. You've picked a bad time to come to town, he told them. The whole region's crawling with Malorian recruiters. We've been up in the mountains, Belgariad said. We'll probably go back in a day or so. Whatever's happening down here doesn't interest us very much. You'd better take an interest while you're here, unless you'd like to try army life. Is there a war someplace? Silk asked him. Likely to be. Or so they say. Someplace down in Mishrak-Achthul, Silk snorted. I've never met a Tull worth fighting. It's not the Tulls. It's supposed to be the Elorns. They've got a queen, if you can imagine such a thing. She's moving to invade the Tulls. A queen? Silk scoffed. Can't be much of an army, then. Let the Tulls fight her themselves. You tell that to the Malorian recruiters, the Nadrak suggested. Did you have to brew that ale? Silk demanded of the serving man, who was returning with 4 large cups. There are other taverns, friend, the serving man replied. If you don't like this one, go find another. That'll be 12 pennies. 3 pennies a cup, Silk exclaimed. Times are hard. Grumbling, Silk paid him. Thanks, the Nadrak they were sitting with said, taking one of the cups. Don't mention it, Silk said sourly. What are the Malorians doing here? Belgariad asked. Rounding up everyone who can stand up, see lightning and hear thunder. They do their recruiting with leg irons, so it's a little hard to refuse. They've got Grolums with them, too, and the Grolums keep their gutting knives out in plain sight as a sort of hint about what might happen to anybody who objects too much. Maybe you were right when you said we picked a bad time to come down out of the mountains, Silk said. The Nadrak nodded. The Grolums say that Torak's stirring in his sleep. Oh, that's not very good news, Silk replied. I think we can all drink to that. The Nadrak lifted his ale cup. You find anything worth digging for up there in the mountains? Silk shook his head. A few traces is all. We've been working the stream beds for free gold. We don't have the equipment to drive shafts back into the rock. You'll never get rich squatting beside a creek and sifting gravel. Oh, we get by, Silk shrugged. Someday, maybe, we'll hit a gold pocket, a good one, and we'll be able to pick up enough to buy some equipment. Yeah, maybe someday it'll rain beer, too, Silk laughed. You ever thought about taking in another partner?"
Silk squinted at the unshaven Nadrak. "Have you been up there before?"
The Nadrak nodded. "Often enough to know that I don't like it. But I think I'd like a stint in the army a lot less."
"Let's have another drink and talk about it," Silk suggested. Garion leaned back, putting his shoulders against the rough log wall. Nadraks didn't seem to be so bad once you got past the crudity of their nature. They were a blunt-spoken people and a bit sour-faced, but they did not seem to have that icy animosity toward outsiders he had noted among the Murgos. He let his mind drift back to what the Nadrak had said about a queen. He quickly dismissed the notion that any of the queens staying at Riva might, under any circumstances, have assumed such authority. That left only Aunt Paul. The Nadrak's information could have been garbled a bit, but in Belgarath's absence Aunt Paul might have taken charge of things. Although that was not like her at all. What could possibly have happened back there to force her to go to such extremes? As the afternoon wore on, more and more of the men in the tavern grew reeling drunk, and occasional fights broke out, although the fights usually consisted of shoving matches, since few in the room were sober enough to aim a good blow. Their companion drank steadily and eventually laid his head down on his arms and began to snore.
"I think we have got just about everything we can use here," Belgarath suggested quietly. "Let's drift on out. From what our friend here says, I don't think it would be a good idea to sleep in town."
Silk nodded his agreement, and the three of them rose from the table and made their way through the crowd to the side door. "Did you want to pick up any supplies?" the little man asked.
Belgarath shook his head. "I have a feeling that we want to get out of here as soon as possible."
Silk gave him a quick look, and the three of them untied their horses, mounted, and rode back out into the red dirt street. They moved at a walk to avoid arousing suspicion, but Garion could feel a sort of tense urgency to put this raw, mud-smeared village behind them. There was something threatening in the air, and the golden late-afternoon sun seemed somehow shadowed, as if by an unseen cloud. As they were passing the last rickety house on the downhill edge of the village, they heard an alarmed shout from somewhere back near the center of town. Garion turned quickly and saw a party of perhaps 20 mounted men in red tunics, plunging at a full gallop toward the tavern. The three of them had just left. With a practiced skill, the scarlet-clad strangers swung down from their horses and immediately covered all of the doors to cut off an escape for those inside.
"Malorians!" Belgarath snapped. "Make for the trees!"
And he drove his heels into his horses' flanks. They galloped across the weedy, stump-cluttered clearing that surrounded the village, toward the edge of the forest and safety. But there was no outcry or pursuit. The tavern appeared to contain enough fish to fill the Malorian net. From a safe vantage point beneath spreading tree limbs, Garion, Silk, and Belgarath watched as a disconsolate-looking string of Nadraks, chained together at the ankle, were led out of the tavern into the red dust of the street to stand under the watchful eyes of the Malorian recruiters.
"It looks like our friend has joined the army after all," Silk observed. "Better him than us," Belgarath replied. "We might be just a little out of place in the middle of an Engrak horde."
He squinted at the ruddy disk of the setting sun.
"Let's move out. We've got a few hours before dark. It looks as if military service might be contagious in this vicinity, and I would not want to catch it."
Chapter 3. The forest of Nadrak was unlike the Erendish forest lying far to the south. The differences were subtle, and it took Garion several days to put his finger on them. For one thing, the trails they followed had no sense of permanence about them. They were so infrequently traveled that they were not beaten into the loamy soil of the forest floor. In the Erendish forest, the marks of man were everywhere.
But here, man was an intruder, merely passing through. Moreover, the forest in Arindia had definite boundaries, but this ocean of trees went on to the farthest edge of the continent, and it had stood so since the beginning of the world. The forest teemed with life. Tawny deer flickered among the trees, and vast shaggy bison, with curved black horns shiny as onyx, grazed in the clearings. Once a bear, grumbling and muttering irritably, lumbered across the trail in front of them. Rabbits scurried through the undergrowth, and partridges exploded into flight from underfoot with a heart-stopping thunder of wings. The ponds and streams abounded with fish, muskrat, otter, and beaver. There were also, they soon discovered, smaller forms of life. The mosquitoes seemed only slightly smaller than sparrows, and there was a nasty little brown fly that bit anything that moved. The sun rose early and set late, dappling the dark forest floor with golden light. Although it was midsummer now, it was never exactly hot, and the air was rich with that smell of urgent growth common to the lands of the north, where summer was short and winter very long. Belgariad seemed not to sleep at all once they entered the forest. Each evening, as Silk and Gerion wearily rolled themselves in their blankets, the old sorcerer threaded his way back into the shadowy trees and disappeared. Once, several hours past dusk on a night filled with starlight, Gerion awoke briefly and heard the loping touch of paws, skittering lightly across a leaf-carpeted clearing. Even as he drifted back to sleep, he understood. The great silver wolf was his grandfather, and he was roaming the night, scouring the surrounding forest for any hint of pursuit or danger. The old man's nocturnal roamings were as silent as smoke, but they did not pass unnoticed. Early one morning, before the sun rose, and while the trees were still hazy and half obscured by ground fog, several shadowy shapes drifted among the dark trunks and stopped not far away. Gerion, who had just risen and was preparing to stir up the fire, froze, half bent over. As he slowly straightened, he could feel eyes on him, and his skin prickled peculiarly. Perhaps 10 feet away stood a huge, dark, gray wolf. The wolf's expression was serious, and its eyes were as yellow as sunlight. There was an unspoken question in those golden eyes, and Gerion realized that he understood the question.
"One wonders why you are doing that."
"Doing what?" Gerion asked politely, responding automatically in the language of wolves.
"Going about in that peculiar form."
"It's necessary to do it."
"Ah."
With exquisite courtesy, the wolf did not pursue the matter further.
"One is curious to know if you don't find it somewhat restricting,"
he noted, however. "It's not as bad as it looks, once one gets used to it." The wolf looked unconvinced. He sat down on his haunches.
"One has seen the other one several times in the past few darknesses,"
he said in the manner of wolves.
"And one is curious to know why you and he have come into our range."
Gerion knew instinctively that his answer to that question was going to be very important. "We are going from one place to another," he replied carefully. "It is not our intention to seek dens or mates in your range, or to hunt the creatures that are yours." He could not have explained how he knew what to say. The wolf seemed satisfied with his response.
"One would be pleased if you would present our esteem to the one with fur like frost," he said formally. "One has noted that he is worthy of great respect."
"One would be pleased to give him your words," Gerion responded, a bit surprised at how easily the elaborate phrasing came to him. The wolf lifted his head and sniffed at the air.
"It is Time for us to hunt. May you find what you seek."
"May your hunt be successful," Garion returned. The wolf turned and padded back into the fog, followed by his companions.
"On the whole, you handled that rather well, Garion,"
Belgarath said from the deep shadows of a nearby thicket. Garion jumped, a bit startled. "I didn't know you were there."
"You should have," the old man replied, stepping out of the shadows.
"How did he know?" Garion asked. "That I'm a wolf sometimes, I mean."
"It shows. A wolf is very alert to that sort of thing."
Silk came out from under the tree where he had been sleeping. The little man's step was wary, but his nose twitched with curiosity. "What was all that about?" he asked.
"The wolves. They wanted to know what we were doing in their territory. They were investigating to see if they were going to have to fight us."
"Fight?"
Garion was startled now. "It is customary when a strange wolf enters the hunting range of another pack. Wolves prefer not to fight. It's a waste of energy. But they will, if the situation demands it."
"What happened?" Silk asked. "Why did they just go away like that?"
Garion convinced them that we were just passing through.
"That was very clever of him."
"Why don't you stir up the fire now, Garion?" Belgarath suggested. "Let's have some breakfast and move on. It is still a long way to Meloria, and we don't want to run out of good weather."
Later that same day, they rode down into a valley where a collection of log houses and tents stood beside a fair-sized stream at the edge of a meadow. "Fur traders," Silk explained to Garion, pointing at the rough settlement. "There are places like this one on just about every major stream in this part of the forest." The little man's pointed nose began to twitch, and his eyes grew bright. "A lot of buying and selling goes on in these little towns."
"Never mind," Belgarath told him pointedly. "Try to keep your predatory instincts under control."
"I wasn't even considering anything," Silk protested.
"Really? Aren't you feeling well?"
Silk loftily ignored that. "Wouldn't it be safer to go around it?" Garion asked as they rode across the broad meadow. Belgarath shook his head.
"I want to know what's going on ahead of us, and the quickest way to find out is to talk to people who have been there. We'll drift in, circulate for an hour or so, and then drift on out again. Just keep your ears open. If anyone asks, we are on our way toward the North Range to look for gold."
There were differences between the hunters and trappers who roamed the streets of this settlement and the miners they had met in the last village. They were more open, for one thing, less surly, and distinctly less belligerent. Garion surmised that the enforced solitude of their occupation made them appreciate companionship all the more during their infrequent visits to the fur-trading centers. Although they drank, probably as much as the miners, their drinking seemed to lead more often to singing and laughter than to fighting. A large tavern stood near the center of the village, and they rode slowly along a dirt street toward it.
"Side door,"
Belgarath said tersely as they dismounted in front of the tavern. They led their horses around the building and tied them at the porch railing. The interior of the tavern was cleaner, less crowded, and somewhat lighter than the miners' tavern had been, and it smelled of woods and of open air instead of damp, musty earth. The three of them sat at a table not far from the door and ordered cups of ale from a polite serving man. The ale was a rich, dark brown, well-chilled, and surprisingly inexpensive. "The fur buyers own the place," Silk explained, wiping foam from his upper lip. "They have discovered that a trapper is easier to bargain with if he is a little drunk, so they make the ale cheap and plentiful." "I suppose that makes sense," Garion admitted. "But don't the trappers know that?" "But of course they do." "Why do they drink before they do business, then?" Silk shrugged. "They like to drink." The two trappers, seated at the next table, were renewing an acquaintanceship that obviously stretched back a dozen years or more. Their beards were both touched with grey, but they spoke light-heartedly in the manner of much younger men.
"You have any trouble with Morindom while you were up there?" one was asking the other.
The second shook his head.
"I put pestilence markers on both ends of the valley where I set out my traps," he replied. "A Morand will go 12 leagues out of his way to avoid a spot that's got the pestilence."
The first nodded his agreement.
"That's usually the best way. Gregor always claimed that curse markers worked better, but as it turned out, he was wrong. I haven't seen him in the last few seasons."
"I'd be surprised if you had. The Morindim got him about 3 years ago. Buried him myself. What was left of him, anyway?"
"Didn't know that. Spent a winter with him once over on the headwaters of the Cardew. He was a mean-tempered sort of man. I'm surprised that the Morindom would cross a curse marker, though."
"As near as I could judge. Some magician came along and uncursed his markers. I found a dried weasel foot hung from one of 'em with 3 stems of grass tied round each toe."
"Oh, now that's a potent spell. Must have wanted him pretty badly for a magician to take that much trouble."
"You know how he was.
He could irritate people 10 leagues away just by walking by." "Well, that's the truth. Not any more, though. His skull's decorating some Morand magician's quest staff now."
Garion leaned toward his grandfather. "What do they mean when they talk about markers?" he whispered.
"They are warnings," Belgarath replied. "Usually sticks poked into the ground, decorated with bones or feathers. The Morindom can't read, so you can't just put up a signboard for them."
A stooped old trapper, his leather clothing patched and shiny from wear, shuffled toward the center of the tavern. His lined, bearded face had a slightly apologetic expression on it. Following after him came a young Nadrak woman in a heavy red felt dress belted about the waist with a glittering chain. There was a leash about her neck, and the old trapper held the end of the tether firmly in his fist. Despite the leash, the young woman's face had a proud, disdainful look, and she stared at the men in the tavern with barely concealed contempt. When the old trapper reached the center of the room, he cleared his throat to get the attention of the crowd.
"I've got a woman I want to sell," he announced loudly.
Without changing expression, the woman spat on him.
"Now, you know, that's just going to lower your price, fella," the old man told her in a placating tone of voice.
"You are an idiot, Tashor," she retorted. "No one here can afford me. You know that. Why didn't you do what I told you to and offer me to the fur buyers?"
"Oh, the fur buyers aren't interested in women, fella," Tashor replied in that same mild tone. "The price will be better here, believe me."
"I wouldn't believe you if you said the sun was going to rise tomorrow, you old fool."
"Well, the woman, as you can see, is quite spirited," Tashor announced rather lamely.
"Is he trying to sell his wife?"
Garion demanded, choking on his ale.
"She is not his wife,"
Silk corrected.
"He owns her, that's all."
Garion clenched his fists and half rose, his face mottled with anger. But Belgarath's hand closed firmly about his wrist.
"Sit down," the old man ordered.
"But—"
"I said sit down, Garion. This is none of your business."
"Unless he wants to buy the woman, of course,"
Silk suggested lightly.
"Is she healthy?"
A lean-faced trapper with a scar across one cheek called to Tashor.
"She is," Tashor declared. "She's got all her teeth, too. Show 'em your teeth, fella."
"They are not looking at my teeth, idiot,"
she told him, looking directly at the scar-faced trapper with a sultry challenge in her black eyes.
"She's an excellent cook," Tashor continued quickly. "She knows the remedies for the rheumatism, and she can dress and tan hides. Doesn't eat too much. Breath don't smell too bad unless she eats onions. Almost never snores, except when she's drunk."
If she's such a good woman, why do you want to sell her? The lean-faced trapper and a friend wanted to know.
I'm getting older,
Tashor replied.
and I'd like a little peace and quiet. Vella's exciting to be around, but I've had all of the excitement I need. I think I'd like to settle down someplace. Maybe raise some chickens or goats."
The old trapper's voice sounded a trifle plaintive. "Oh, this is impossible," Vella burst out. "Do I have to do everything myself? Get out of the way, Tashor." Rudely, she pushed the old trapper aside and glared at the crowd, her black eyes flashing. "All right," she announced firmly. "Let's get down to business. Tashor wants to sell me. I'm strong and healthy. I can cook, cure hides and skins, tend to common illnesses, bargain closely when I buy supplies, and I can brew good beer." Her eyes narrowed grimly. "I have not gone to any man's bed, and I keep my daggers sharp enough to persuade strangers not to try to force me. I can play the wood flute, and I know many old stories. I can make curse markers and pestilence markers and dream markers to frighten off the Morindum, and once I killed a bear at 30 paces with a bow."
20 paces,
Tashor corrected mildly. "It was closer to 30, she insisted. "Can you dance?" the lean trapper with the scarred face asked. She looked directly at him. "Only if you are seriously interested in buying me." "We can talk about that after I see you dance." "Can you hold a beat?" "I can." "Very well." Her hands went to the chain about her waist, and it jingled as she unfastened it. She opened the heavy red dress, stepped out of it, and handed it to Tashor. Then she carefully untied the leash from about her neck and bound a ribbon of red silk about her head to hold back her wealth of lustrous blue-black hair. Beneath the red felt dress, she wore a filmy, rose-colored gown of Malorian silk that whispered and clung to her as she moved. The silk gown reached to mid-calf, and she wore soft leather boots on her feet. Protruding from the top of each boot was the jeweled hilt of a dagger, and a third dagger rode on the leather belt about her waist. Her gown was caught in a tight collar about her throat, but it left her arms bare to the shoulder. She wore a half-dozen narrow gold bracelets about each wrist. With a conscious grace, she bent and fastened a string of small bells to each ankle. Then she lifted her smoothly rounded arms until her hands were beside her face. "This is the beat, Scarface," she told the trapper. "Try to hold it." And she began to clap her hands together. The beat was 3 measured claps, followed by 4 staccato ones. Vella began her dance slowly with a kind of insolent strut. Her gown whispered as she moved, its hem sighing about her lush calves. The lean trapper took up her beat, his calloused hands clapping together loudly in the sudden silence as Vella danced. Garion began to blush. Vella's movements were subtle and fluid. The bells at her ankles and the bracelets about her wrists played a tinkling counterpoint to the trapper's beat. Her feet seemed almost to flicker in the intricate steps of her dance, and her arms wove patterns in the air. Other, even more interesting, things were going on inside the rose-colored gossamer gown. Garion swallowed hard and discovered that he had almost stopped breathing. Vella began to whirl, and her long black hair flared out, almost perfectly matching the flare of her gown. Then she slowed and once again dropped back into that proud, sensual strut that challenged every man in the room. They cheered when she stopped, and she smiled a slow, mysterious little smile. "You dance very well," the scar-faced trapper observed. "Naturally. I do everything very well." "Are you in love with anyone?" The question was bluntly put. "No man has won my heart," Vella declared flatly. "I haven't seen a man yet who was worthy of me." "That may change," the trapper suggested. 1 gold mark. It was a firm offer. "You're not serious."
5 gold marks.
1.5.
This is just too insulting.
Bella raised both hands up in the air, and her face took on a tragic expression.
Not a copper less than 4.
2 gold marks, the trapper offered.
Unbelievable,
she exclaimed, spreading both arms.
Why don't you just cut my heart out and have done with it? I couldn't consider anything less than 3.5.
To save time, why don't we just say 3? He said it firmly, with intention that the arrangement become permanent, he added, almost as an afterthought.
Permanent?
Bella's eyes widened. I like you. Well, what do you say?
Stand up. Let me have a look at you.
Slowly he unwound himself from the chair in which he had lounged. His tall body was as lean as his scarred face, and there was a hard, muscled quality about him. Bella pursed her lips and looked him over.
Not bad, is he?
She murmured to Teshar.
You could do worse, Vela,
her owner answered encouragingly.
I will consider your offer of 3 with intentions,
Vela declared.
Have you got a name?
Tech. The tall trapper introduced himself with a slight bow.
Well then, Tech, don't go away. Teshar and I need to talk over your offer.
She gave him an almost shy look.
I think I like you too,
she added, in a much less challenging tone. Then she took hold of the leash that was still wrapped around Teshar's fist and led him out of the tavern, glancing back over her shoulder once or twice at the lean-faced Tech. That is a lot of woman, Silk murmured with a note of profound respect. Geryon found that he was able to breathe again, though his ears still felt very hot.
What did they mean by intention?
He quietly asked Silk.
Tech offered an arrangement that usually leads to marriage,
Silk explained. That baffled Geryon.
I don't understand at all,
he confessed.
Just because someone owns her doesn't give him any special rights to her person,
Silk told him.
And those daggers of hers enforce that. One does not approach a Nadrak woman unless one's tired of living. She makes that decision. The wedding, customarily, takes place after the birth of her first child.
Why was she so interested in the price?
Because she gets half,
Silk shrugged.
She gets half of the money every time she's sold?
Geryon was incredulous.
But of course, it would hardly be fair otherwise, now would it?
The serving man who was bringing them 3 more cups of ale had stopped now and was staring openly at Silk. Is something wrong, friend? Silk asked him mildly. The serving man lowered his eyes quickly.
Sorry, he mumbled. I just thought you reminded me of somebody, that's all. Now that I see you closer, I realized that I was mistaken.
He put down the cups quickly, turned, and laughed without picking up the coins Silk had laid on the table.
I think we had better leave,
Silk said quietly.
What's the matter?
He knows who I am. And there's that reward notice that's being circulated.
Maybe you're right, Belgariad agreed, rising to his feet.
He's talking with those men over there,
Geryon said, watching the serving man, who was in urgent conversation with a group of hunters on the far side of the room, and was casting frequent looks in their direction.
We've got about a half a minute to get outside. Let's go.
The 3 of them moved quickly toward the door.
You there,
someone behind them shouted.
Wait a minute.
Run, Belgariad barked, and they bolted outside and hurled themselves into their saddles just as a half-dozen leather-garbed men burst out through the tavern door. The shout,
"Stop those men!"
went largely unheeded as they galloped off down the street. Trappers and hunters as a breed were seldom inclined to mix themselves into other men's affairs, and Geryon, Silk, and Belgarath had passed through the village and were splashing across a ford before any kind of pursuit could be organized. Silk was swearing as they entered the forest on the far side of the river, spitting out oaths like melon seeds. His profanity was colorful and wide-ranging, reflecting on the birth, parentage, and uncleanly habits of not only those pursuing them, but of those responsible for circulating the reward notice as well. Belgarath reined in sharply, raising his hand as he did. Silk and Geryon hauled their horses to a stop. Silk continued to swear.
"Do you suppose you could cut short your eloquence for a moment?" Belgarath asked him. "I am trying to listen."
Silk muttered a few more choice oaths, then clamped his teeth shut. There were confused shouts far behind them, and a certain amount of splashing.
"They're crossing the stream," Belgarath noted. "Looks as if they plan to take this business seriously. Seriously enough to chase us, at any rate."
"Won't they give up when it gets dark?"
"They are Nadrak hunters," Silk said, sounding profoundly disgusted. "They will follow us for days, just for the enjoyment of the hunt." "There's not much we can do about that now," Belgarath grunted. "Let's see if we can outrun them."
And he thumped his heels to his horse. It was mid-afternoon as they rode at a gallop through the sunlit forest. The undergrowth was scanty, and the tall, straight trunks of fir and pine rose like great columns toward the blue sky overhead. It was a good day for a ride, but not a good day for being chased. No day was good for that. They topped her eyes and stopped again to listen. "They seem to be falling behind," Geryon noted hopefully. "They're just the drunk ones," Silk disagreed sourly. "The ones who are serious about all of this are probably much closer by now." "You don't shout when you're hunting. See, look back there," he pointed. Geryon looked. There was a pale flicker back among the trees. A man on a white horse was riding in their direction, leaning far over in his saddle and looking intently at the ground as he rode. "If he is any kind of a tracker at all, it will take us a week to shake him off," Silk said disgustedly. Somewhere, far off among the trees to their right, a wolf howled. "Let's keep going," Belgarath told them. They galloped on then, plunging down the far side of the rise, threading their way among the trees. The thud of their horses' hoofs was a muffled drumming on the thick loam of the forest floor, and clots of half-decayed debris spattered out behind them as they fled. "We are leaving a trail as wide as a house," Silk shouted to Belgarath. "That can't be helped for now," the old man replied. "We need some more distance before we start playing games with the tracks." Another howl drifted mournfully through the forest, from the left this time. It seemed a bit closer than the first had been. They rode on for another quarter of an hour, and then they suddenly heard a great babble of confusion to the rear. Men were shouting with alarm, and horses squealed in a panic. Geryon could also hear savage growls. At Belgarath's signal, they slowed their horses to listen. The terrified squeals of horses rang sharply through the trees, punctuated by their riders' curses and frightened shouts. A chorus of howls rose from all around. The forest seemed suddenly full of wolves. The pursuit behind them disintegrated as the horses of the Nadrak reward hunters bolted with screams of sheer panic in every direction. With a certain grim satisfaction, Belgarath listened to the fading sounds behind them. Then, his tongue lolling from his mouth, a huge, dark-furred wolf trotted out of the woods about 30 yards away, stopped and dropped to his haunches, his yellow eyes gazing intently at them. "Keep a tight grip on your reins," Belgarath instructed quietly, stroking the neck of his suddenly wild-eyed mount. The wolf did not say anything, but merely sat and watched. Belgarath returned that steady gaze quite calmly, then finally nodded once in acknowledgment. The wolf rose, turned, and started off into the trees. He stopped once, glanced back over his shoulder at them, and raised his muzzle to lift the deep, bell-toned howl that summoned the other members of his pack to return to their interrupted hunt. Then, with a flicker, he was gone. Only the echo of his howl remained. Chapter 4. They rode east for the next several days, gradually descending into a broad marshy valley where the undergrowth was denser and the air noticeably more humid. A brief summer shower rolled in one afternoon, accompanied by great ripping crashes of thunder, a deluge of pounding rain, and winds that howled among the trees, bending and tossing them and tearing leaves and twigs from the underbrush to whirl and fly among the dark trunks. The storm soon passed, and the sun came out again. After that, the weather continued fair, and they made good time. Gerion felt a peculiar sense of incompleteness as he rode, and he sometimes caught himself looking around for missing friends. The long journey in search of the orb had established a sort of pattern in his mind, a sense of rightness and wrongness, and this trip felt wrong. Barak was not with them, for one thing, and the big red-bearded Kerak's absence made Gerion feel oddly insecure. He also missed the hawk-faced silent Hetar, and the armored form of Mandoralan riding always at the front, with the silver and blue pennon snapping from the tip of his lance. He was painfully lonely for Dernek the smith, and he even missed Zenedra's spiteful bickering. What had happened at Reva became less and less real to him, and all the elaborate ceremony that had attended his betrothal to the impossible little princess began to fade in his memory, like some half-forgotten dream. It was one evening, however, after the horses had been picketed and supper was over, and they had rolled themselves in their blankets to sleep, that Gerion, staring into the dying embers of their fire, came at last to face the central vacancy that had entered his life. Aunt Paul was not with them, and he missed her terribly. Since childhood he had felt that so long as Aunt Paul was nearby, nothing could really go wrong that she could not fix. Her calm, steady presence had been the one thing to which he had always clung. As clearly as if she stood before him, Gerion could see her face, her glorious eyes, and that white lock at her brow. The sudden loneliness for her was as sharp as the edge of a knife. Everything felt wrong without her. Belgariad was here, certainly, and Gerion was fairly sure that his grandfather could deal with any purely physical dangers, but there were other, less obvious perils that the old man either did not consider or chose to ignore. To whom could Gerion turn when he was afraid, for example? Being afraid was not the sort of thing that endangered life or limb, but it was still an injury of sorts, and sometimes a deeper and more serious kind of injury. Aunt Paul had always been able to banish his fears, but now she was not here. And Gerion was afraid, and he could not even admit it. He sighed and pulled his blankets more closely about him and slowly drifted into a troubled sleep. It was about noon, some days later, when they reached the east fork of the river Cordu, a broad, dirty brown flow running through a brushy valley in a generally southerly direction toward the capital at Gar Og Nadrak. The pale green, waist-high brush extended back several hundred yards from either bank of the river, and was silt-smeared by the high waters of the spring runoff. The sultry air above the brush was alive with clouds of gnats and mosquitoes. A sullen boatman ferried them across to the village standing on the far bank. As they led their horses off onto the ferry landing, Belgariad spoke quietly.
"I think we'll want to change direction here. Let's split up. I'll go pick up supplies, and the two of you go find the town tavern. See if you can get some information about passes leading up through the south range into the lands of the Morendum. The sooner we get up there, the better. The Malorians seem to be getting the upper hand here, and they could clamp down without much warning. I don't want to have to start explaining my every move to Malorian Grolums,
not to mention the fact that there's a great deal of interest in Silk's whereabouts just now."
Silk rather glumly agreed. "I'd like to get that matter straightened out, but I don't suppose that we really have the time, do we?"
"No, not really. The summer is very, very short up north, and the crossing to Meloria is unpleasant, even in the best of weather. When you get to the tavern, tell everybody that we want to try our luck in the gold fields of the North Range. There's bound to be somebody around who will want to show off his familiarity with trails and passes, particularly if you offer to buy him a few drinks."
"I thought you said you knew the way."
"I know one way, but it is 100 leagues east of here. Let's see if there's something a little closer. I will come by the tavern after I get the supplies."
The old man mounted and went off up the dirt street, leading their pack-horse behind him. Silk and Geryon had little trouble finding someone in the smelly tavern willing to talk about trails and passes. Quite to the contrary. Their first question sparked a general debate.
"That's the long way around, Besher,"
one tipsy gold hunter interrupted another's detailed description of a mountain pass.
"You go left at the falls of the stream. It saves you 3 days.
"I'm telling this, Varn," Besher retorted testily, banging his fist down on the scarred table. "You can tell him about the way you go when I'm finished."
"It'll take you all day, just like that trail you're so fond of. You want to go look for gold, not admire the scenery."
Varn's long, stubbled jaw thrust out belligerently. "Which way do we go when we get to the long meadow up on top?" Silk asked quickly, trying to head off the hostilities.
"You go right,"
Besher declared, glaring at Varn. Varn thought about that, as if looking for an excuse to disagree. Finally, he reluctantly nodded.
"Of course, that's the only way you can go, but once you get through the Juniper Grove, you turn left."
He said it in the tone of a man anticipating contradiction.
"Left?" Besher objected loudly. "You're a blockhead, Varn. You go right again."
"What you calling a blockhead, you jackass?" Without any further discussion, Besher punched Varn in the mouth, and the two of them began to pummel each other, reeling about and knocking over the benches and tables.
"They're both wrong, of course,"
another miner sitting at a nearby table observed calmly, watching the fight with a clinical detachment.
"You keep going straight after you get through the Juniper Grove."
Several burly men, wearing loose-fitting red tunics over their polished mail shirts, had entered the tavern unnoticed during the altercation, and they stepped forward, grinning to separate Varn and Besher as the two rolled around on the dirty floor. Geryon felt Silk stiffen beside him.
"Melorians,"
the little man said softly.
"What do we do?"
Geryon whispered, looking around for a way of escape. But before Silk could answer, a black-robed Grolem stepped through the door.
"I'd like to see men who are so eager to fight,"
the Grolem purred, with a peculiar accent.
"The army needs such men."
"Recruiters!" Varn exclaimed, breaking away from the red-garbed Melorians and dashing toward a side door. For a second it looked as if he might escape, but as he reached the doorway, someone outside rapped him sharply across the forehead with a stout cudgel. He reeled back, suddenly rubber-legged and vacant-eyed. The Melorian who had hit him came inside, gave him a critical, appraising glance, and then judiciously clubbed him in the head again.
"Well?"
the Grolem asked, looking around with amusement.
"What is it to be? Would any more of you like to run, or would you all prefer to come along quietly?"
"Where are you taking us?" Besher demanded, trying to pull his arm out of the grip of one of the grinning recruiters.
"To Gar Nadrak first,"
the Grolem replied.
"And then south, to the plains of Mishrak Achtul, and the encampment of His Imperial Majesty, Zakrath, Emperor of all Meloria. You have just joined the army, my friends. All of Angarak rejoices in your courage and patriotism. And Torak himself is pleased with you."
As if to emphasize his words, the Grolem's hand strayed to the hilt of the sacrificial knife sheathed at his belt. The chain clinked spitefully as Geryon, fettered at the ankle, plodded along, one in a long line of disconsolate-looking conscripts, following a trail leading generally southward through the brush along the riverbank. The conscripts had all been roughly searched for weapons, all but Geryon, who for some reason had been overlooked. He was painfully aware of the huge sword strapped to his back as he walked along, but as always seemed to happen, no one else paid any attention to it. Before they had left the village, while they were all being shackled, Geryon and Silk had held a brief, urgent discussion in the minute finger movements of the Drasnian secret language. "I could pick this lock with my thumbnail," Silk had asserted with a disdainful flip of his fingers. "As soon as it gets dark tonight, I'll unhook us and we'll leave. I don't really think military life would agree with me, and it's wildly inappropriate for you to be joining an Angarak army just now, all things considered." "Where's Grandfather?" Geryon had signaled. "Oh, I imagine he's about." Geryon, however, was worried, and a whole platoon of what-ifs immediately jumped into his mind. To avoid thinking about them, he covertly studied the Melorians who guarded them. The Grolem and the bulk of his detachment had moved on, once the captives had been shackled, seeking other villages and other recruits, leaving only 5 of their number behind to escort this group south. Melorians were somewhat different from other Angaraks. Their eyes had the characteristic angularity, but their bodies seemed not to have the singleness of purpose which so dominated the western tribes. They were burly, but they did not have the broad-shouldered athleticism of the Murgos. They were tall, but did not have the lean whippet-like frames of the Nadraks. They were obviously strong, but they did not have the thick-waisted brute power of the Tulls. There was about them, moreover, a kind of disdainful superiority when they looked at Western Angaraks. They spoke to their prisoners in short, barking commands, and when they talked to each other their dialect was so thick that it was nearly unintelligible. They wore mail shirts covered by coarse-woven red tunics. They did not ride their horses very well, Geryon noted, and their curved swords and broad round shields seemed to get in their way as they attempted to manage the reins. Geryon carefully kept his head down to hide the fact that his features, even more than Silk's, were distinctly non-Angarak. The guards, however, paid little attention to the conscripts as individuals, but seemed rather to be more interested in them as numbers. They rode continually up and down the sweating column, counting bodies and referring to a document they carried with concerned, even worried expressions. Geryon surmised that unpleasant things would happen if their numbers did not match when they reached Gar Nadrak. A faint, pale flicker in the underbrush, some distance uphill from the trail, caught Geryon's eye, and he turned his head sharply in that direction. A large, silver-gray wolf was ghosting along just at the edge of the trees, his pace exactly matching theirs. Geryon quickly lowered his head again, pretending to stumble, and fell heavily against Silk. "Grandfather's out there," he whispered. "Did you only just notice him?" Silk sounded surprised. "I've been watching him for the last hour or more." When the trail turned away from the river and entered the trees, Geryon felt the tension building up in him. He could not be sure what Belgariad was going to do, but he knew that the concealment offered by the forest provided the opportunity for which his grandfather had doubtless been waiting. He tried to hide his growing nervousness as he walked along behind Silk, but the slightest sound in the woods around them made him start uncontrollably. The trail dipped down into a fair-sized clearing, surrounded on all sides by tall ferns, and the Malorian guards halted the column to allow their prisoners to rest. Geryon sank gratefully to the springy turf beside Silk. The effort of walking with one leg shackled to the long chain which bound the conscripts together was considerable, and he found that he was sweating profusely. "What is he waiting for?" he whispered to Silk. The rat-faced little man shrugged. "It is still a few hours until dark," he replied softly. "Maybe he wants to wait for that." Then, some distance up the trail, they heard the sound of singing. The song was ribald and badly out of tune, but the singer was quite obviously enjoying himself, and the slurring of the words as he drew closer indicated that he was more than a little drunk. The Malorians grinned at each other.
"Another patriot, perhaps," one of them smirked. "Coming to enlist. Spread out. We will gather him up as soon as he comes into the clearing."
The singing Nadrak rode into view on a large roan horse. He wore the usual dark-stained leather clothing, and a fur cap perched precariously on one side of his head. He had a scraggly black beard, and he carried a wineskin in one hand. He seemed to be swaying in his saddle as he rode, but something about his eyes showed him not to be quite so drunk as he appeared. Geryon stared at him openly as he rode into the clearing with a string of mules behind him. It was Yarblek, the Nadrak merchant they had encountered on the south caravan route in Cthulmurgos.
"Hold there,"
Yarblek greeted the Malorians in a loud voice.
"I see you've had good hunting. That's a healthy-looking bunch of recruits you got there." "The hunting just got easier," one of the Malorians grinned at him, pulling his horse across the trail to block Yarblek's way. "You... Me?
Yarblek laughed uproariously.
"Don't be a fool. I'm too busy to play soldier." "That's a shame," the Malorian replied. "I'm Yarblek, a merchant of Yartorak, and a friend of King Drosta himself. I am acting on a commission that he personally put into my hands. If you interfere with me in any way, Drosta will have you flayed and roasted alive as soon as you get to Gar Og Nadrak."
The Malorian looked a trifle less sure of himself.
"We answer only to Zakath,"
he asserted a bit defensively.
"King Drosta has no authority over us."
"You are in Gar Og Nadrak, friend," Yarblek pointed out to him.
"And Drosta does whatever he likes here. You might have to apologize to Zakath after it's all over, but by then the 5 of you will probably be peeled and cooked to a turn." "I suppose that you can prove you are on official business," the Malorian guard hedged. "But of course I can,"
Yarblek replied. He scratched at his head, his face taking on an expression of foolish perplexity.
"Where did I put that parchment?"
he muttered to himself, and then he snapped his fingers.
"Oh, yes. Now I remember. It's in the pack on the last mule. Here, have a drink. I'll go get it."
He tossed the wineskin to the Malorian, turned his horse, and rode back to the end of his pack string. He dismounted and began rummaging through a canvas pack.
"We better have a look at his documents before we decide," one of the others advised. "King Drosta is not a sort you want to cross."
"We might as well have a drink while we are waiting,"
another suggested, eyeing the wineskin.
"That's the one thing that we can agree on,"
the first replied, working loose the stopper of the leather bag. He raised the skin with both hands and lifted his chin to drink. There was a solid-sounding thud, and the feathered shaft of an arrow was quite suddenly protruding from his throat, just at the top of his red tunic. The wine gushed from the skin to pour down over his astonished face. His companions gaped at him, then reached for their weapons with cries of alarm. But it was too late. Most of them tumbled from their saddles in the sudden storm of arrows that struck them from the concealment of the ferns. One, however, wheeled his mount to flee, clutching at the shaft buried deep in his side. The horse took no more than 2 leaps before 3 arrows sank into the Malorian's back. He stiffened, then toppled over limply, his foot hanging up in his stirrup as he fell, and his frightened horse bolted, dragging him, bouncing and flopping back down the trail.
"I can't seem to locate the document," Yarblek declared, walking back with a wicked grin on his face.
He turned the Malorian he had been speaking to over with his foot.
"You didn't really want to see it anyway, did you?" he asked the dead man.
The Malorian with the arrow in his throat stared blankly up at the sky, his mouth agape and a trickle of blood running out of his nose.
"I didn't think so."
Yarblek laughed coarsely. He drew back his foot and kicked the dead man back over onto his face. Then he turned to smirk at Silk as his archers came out of the dark green ferns.
"You certainly get around, Silk. I thought Taurogos had finished you back there in stinking Tolmurgos."
"He miscalculated," Silk replied casually.
"How did you manage to get yourself conscripted into the Malorian army?"
Yarblek asked curiously. All traces of his feigned drunkenness gone now. Silk shrugged.
"I got careless. I have been following you for the last 3 days.
I'm touched by your concern." Silk lifted his fettered ankle and jingled the chain. "Would it be too much trouble for you to unlock this?"
"You're not going to do anything foolish, are you?"
"No, of course not."
"Find the key,"
Yarblek told one of his archers.
"What you going to do with us?"
Besher asked nervously, eyeing the dead guards with a certain apprehension. Yarblek laughed.
"What you do once the chains are off is up to you," he answered indifferently. "I wouldn't recommend staying in the vicinity of so many dead Malorians, though. Somebody might come along and start asking questions." "You're just going to let us go?"
Besher demanded incredulously.
"Well, I'm certainly not going to feed you," Yarblek told him.
The archers went down the chain, unlocking the shackles, and each Nadrak bolted into the bushes as soon as he was free.
"Well then,"
Yarblek said, rubbing his palms together,
"now that has been taken care of, why don't we have a drink?"
"That guard spilled all of your wine when he fell off of his horse," Silk pointed out.
"Oh, that wasn't my wine," Yarblek snorted. "I stole it this morning. You should know I would not offer my own drink to somebody that I plan to kill."
"I wondered about that." Silk grinned at him. "I thought that maybe your manners had started to slip." Yarblek's coarse face took on a faintly injured expression. "Oh, sorry," Silk apologized quickly. "I misjudged you."
"No harm done,"
Yarblek shrugged.
"A lot of people misunderstand me." He sighed then. "It's a burden that I have to bear."
He opened a pack on his lead mule and hefted out a small keg of ale. He set it on the ground and broached it with a practiced skill, bashing in its top with his fist.
"Let's get drunk," he suggested.
"Oh, we'd really like to," Silk declined politely. "But we have got some rather urgent business to take care of."
"You have no idea how sorry I am about that,"
Yarblek replied, fishing several cups out of the pack.
"Oh, I knew you'd understand." "Oh, I understand all right, Silk."
Yarblek bent and dipped 2 cups into the ale keg.
"And I am as sorry as I can be that your business is going to have to wait. Here."
He gave Silk 1 cup and Garion the other, and then he turned and dipped out a cup for himself. Silk looked at him with one raised eyebrow. Yarblek sprawled on the ground beside the ale keg, comfortably resting his feet on the body of one of the dead Malorians.
"You see, Silk, the whole point of all of this is that Drosta wants you, very badly. He's offering a reward for you that is just too attractive to pass up. A friendship is one thing, but business is business after all. Now, why don't you and your young friend make yourselves comfortable? This is a nice, shady clearing with soft moss to lie on. We will all get drunk, and you can tell me how you managed to escape from Taurogos. And then you can tell me what happened to that handsome woman you had with you down in Tolmurgos. Maybe I can make enough money from this to be able to afford to buy her,
"Oh, I'm not the marrying kind, but by Torak's teeth, that was a fine-looking woman. I'd almost be willing to give up my freedom for her."
"I'm sure that she'd be flattered," Silk replied. "What then?"
"What when?"
"After we get drunk. What do we do then?"
"Oh, we'll probably get sick. That is what usually happens. After we all get well, we will run on down to Gar Og Nadrak. I will collect the reward for you, and you will be able to find out why King Drosta Lekton wants to get his hands onto you so badly."
He looked at Silk with an amused expression.
"Oh, you might as well sit down and have a drink, my friend. You aren't going anywhere just now."
Chapter 5. Gar Og Nadrak was a walled city lying at the juncture of the east and west forks of the river Cordu. The forest had been cleared for a league or so in every direction from the capital by the simple expedient of setting fire to it, and the approach to the city passed through a wilderness of burned black snags and rank-growing bramble thickets. The city gates were stout and smeared with tar. Surmounting them was a stone replica of the Mask of Torak. That beautiful, inhumanly cruel face gazed down at all who entered, and Gerion suppressed a shudder as he rode under it. The houses in the Nadrak capital were all very tall, and had steeply sloping roofs. The windows of the second stories all had shutters, and most of the shutters were closed. Any exposed wood on the structures had been smeared with tar to preserve it, and the splotches of the black substance made all the buildings look somehow diseased. There was a sullen, frightened air in the narrow, crooked streets of Gar Og Nadrak, and the inhabitants kept their eyes lowered as they hurried about their business. There appeared to be less leather involved in the clothing of the burghers of the capital than had been the case in the back country, but even here most garments were black, and only occasionally was there a splash of blue or yellow. The sole exception to this rule were the red tunics worn by the Malorian soldiers. They seemed to be everywhere, roaming at will up and down the streets and cobblestone roads, accosting citizens rudely and talking loudly to each other in their heavily accented speech. While the soldiers seemed for the most part to be merely swaggering bullies, young men who concealed their nervousness at being in a strange country with an outward show of bluster and braggadocio, the Malorian Grolums were quite another matter. Unlike the western Grolums Gerion had seen in Skolmurgos, they rarely wore the polished steel mask, but rather assumed a set, grim expression, thin-lipped and narrow-eyed, as they went about the streets in their hooded black robes. Everyone, Malorian and Nadrak alike, gave way to them. Gerion and Silk, closely guarded and mounted on a pair of mules, followed the rangy Yarblak into the city. Yarblak and Silk had kept up their banter during the entire ride downriver, exchanging casual insults and reliving past indiscretions. Although he seemed friendly enough, Yarblak nonetheless remained watchful, and his men had guarded Silk and Gerion every step of the way. Gerion had covertly watched the forest almost continually during the 3-day ride, but he had seen no sign of Belgariad, and he entered the city in a state of jumpy apprehension. Silk, however, seemed relaxed and confident as always, and his behavior and attitude grated at Gerion's nerves for some reason. After they had clattered along a crooked street for some distance, Yarblak turned down a narrow, dirty alleyway leading toward the river. "I thought the palace was that way," Silk said to him, pointing toward the center of town.
"It is," Yarblak replied. "But we are not going to the palace. Drosta's got company there, and he prefers to do business in private."
The alleyway soon opened out into a seedy-looking street, where the tall, narrow-looking houses had fallen somewhat into disrepair. The lanky Nadrak clamped his mouth shut as 2 Malorian Grolums rounded a corner just ahead and came in their direction. Yarblak's expression was openly hostile as the two approached. One of them stopped to return his gaze.
"You seem to have a problem, friend,"
the Grolum suggested.
That is my business, isn't it?
Yarblek retorted.
Indeed it is,
the Grolem replied coolly.
Don't let it get out of hand, though. Open disrespect for the priesthood is the sort of thing that could get you into serious trouble.
The black-robed man's look was threatening. On a sudden impulse, Garion carefully pushed out his mind toward the Grolem, probing very gently. But the thoughts he encountered showed no particular awareness, and certainly none of the aura that always seemed to emanate from the mind of a sorcerer.
Don't do that, the voice in his mind cautioned him. It's like ringing a bell or wearing a sign around your neck.
Garion quickly pulled back his thoughts.
I thought all of the Grolems were sorcerers, he replied silently. These two are just ordinary men.
But the other awareness was gone. The two Grolems passed, and Yarblek spat contemptuously in the street.
Pigs, he muttered. I am starting to dislike Malorians almost as much as Murgos.
Oh, they seem to be taking over your country, Yarblek, Sulk observed. Yarblek grunted.
Let one Malorian in, and before long they are underfoot everywhere.
Why did you let them in to begin with? Silk asked mildly.
Silk,
Yarblek said bluntly,
I know you are a spy, and I am not going to discuss politics with you, so quit fishing for information.
I'm just passing the time of day, Silk replied innocently.
Why don't you mind your own business?
But this is my business, old friend. Yarblek stared hard at him, then suddenly laughed. Where are we going? Silk asked him, looking around at the shabby street. This isn't the best part of town, as I recall.
You will find out,
Yarblek told him. They rode on down the river where the smell of the floating garbage and open sewers was quite nearly overpowering. Garion saw rats feeding in the gutters, and the men in the street wore shabby clothing and had that furtive look of those who have reason to avoid the police. Yarblek turned his horse abruptly and led them into another narrow, filthy alleyway.
We will walk from here, he said, dismounting. I want to go in the back way.
Leaving their mounts with one of his men, they went on down the alley, stepping carefully over piles of rotting garbage.
Down there,
Yarblek told them, pointing at a short, rickety flight of wooden stairs leading down to a narrow doorway.
Once we get inside, keep your heads down. We do not want too many people noticing that you are not Nadrak.
They went down the creaking steps and slipped through the doorway into a dim, smoky tavern, reeking of sweat, spilled beer, and stale vomit. The fire pit in the center of the room was choked with ash, and several large logs smoldered there, giving off a great deal of smoke and very little light. Two narrow, dirty windows at the front appeared only slightly less dark than the walls around them, and a single oil lamp hung on a chain nailed to one of the rafters.
Sit here,
Yarblek instructed them, nudging at a bench standing against the back wall.
I will be right back.
He went off toward the front part of the tavern. Garion looked around quickly, but saw immediately that a pair of Yarblek's men lounged unobtrusively beside the door.
What are we going to do?
He whispered to Silk. We don't have much choice, but to wait and see what happens, Silk replied.
You don't seem very worried.
I'm not, really.
But we've been arrested, haven't we?
Silk shook his head. When you arrest someone, you put shackles on him. King Drosta wants to talk to me, that's all.
But the reward notice said...
I wouldn't pay too much attention to that, Garion. The reward notice was for the benefit of the Malorians, whatever Drosta is up to. He does not want them finding out about it. Yarblek threaded his way back through the crowd in the tavern and thumped himself down on the grimy bench beside them.
Drosta should be here shortly. You want something to drink while we are waiting?
Silk looked around with a faint expression of distaste.
Oh,
"I don't think so," he replied. "The ale barrels in places like this usually have a few drowned rats floating in them, and not to mention the dead flies and roaches."
Suit yourself," Yarblek said.
"Isn't this a peculiar sort of place to find a king?" Garion asked, looking around at the shabby interior of the tavern.
"You have to know King Drosta to understand," Silk told him. "He has some rather notorious appetites, and these riverfront dives suit him."
Yarblek laughed in agreement.
"Oh, monarch's a lusty sort of fellow, but don't ever make the mistake of thinking that he is stupid. Or a little crude, perhaps, but not stupid. He can come to a place like this, and no Malorian will take the trouble to follow him. He has found that it is a good way to conduct business, that he prefers not to have reported back to Zakath."
There was a stir near the front of the tavern, and 2 heavy-shouldered Nadraks in black leather tunics and pointed helmets pushed their way through the door.
"Make way,"
one of them barked.
"And everybody rise."
"Those who are able to rise."
A wave of jeers and catcalls ran through the crowd as a thin man in a yellow satin doublet and a fur-trimmed green velvet cloak entered. His eyes were bulging, and his face was deeply scarred with old pockmarks. His movements were quick and jerky, and his expression was a curious mixture of sardonic amusement and a kind of desperate, unsatisfied hunger.
"I'll hail His Majesty, Drosta Lekton, King of the Nadraks,"
one drunken man proclaimed in a loud voice, and the others in the tavern laughed coarsely, jeering and whistling and stamping their feet.
"My faithful subjects,"
the pock-marked man replied with a gross smirk.
"Drunks, thieves, and procurers, I bask in the warm glow of your love for me."
His contempt seemed directed almost as much at himself as at the ragged, unwashed crowd. They whistled in unison and stamped their feet derisively.
"How many tonight, Drosta?"
someone shouted.
"As many as I can," the king leered. "It is my duty to spread royal blessings wherever I go." "Is that what you call it?" someone else demanded raucously. "It is as good a name as any," Drosta replied with a shrug.
"The royal bedchamber awaits,"
the tavern owner declaimed with a mocking bow.
"Along with the royal bedbugs, I am sure," Drosta added. "Ale for every man, not too drunk to swell it down. Let my loyal subjects drink to my vitality."
The crowd cheered as the king pushed toward a stairway leading to the upper stories of the building.
"My duty awaits me,"
he proclaimed, pointing with a grand gesture up the stairs.
"Let all take note of how eagerly I go to embrace that stern responsibility."
He mounted the stairs to the derisive applause of the assembled riffraff.
"What now?"
Silk asked.
"Oh, we will wait a bit," Yarblek replied. "It would be a little obvious if we went up immediately."
Garion shifted uncomfortably on the bench. A very faint, nervous kind of tingle had begun just behind his ears, a sort of prickling sensation that seemed to crawl over his skin. He had an unpleasant thought or two about the possibility of lice or fleas migrating from the scum in the tavern in search of fresh blood, but he dismissed that idea. The tingling did not seem to be external. At a table not far away, a shabbily dressed man, apparently far gone in his drink, had been snoring with his head buried in his arms. In the middle of a snore, he raised his face briefly and winked. It was Belgariad. He let his face drop back onto his arms as a wave of relief swept over Garion. The drunken crowd in the tavern grew steadily more rowdy. A short, ugly fight broke out near the fire pit, and the revelers at first cheered, then joined in, kicking at the 2 who rolled about on the floor.
"Let's go up,"
Yarblek said shortly, rising to his feet. He pushed through the crowd and started upstairs.
"Grandfather's here,"
Garion whispered to Silk as they followed.
"I saw him,"
Silk replied shortly. The stairs led to a dim upper hallway with dirty, threadbare carpeting on the floor. At the far end, King Drosta's 2 bored-looking guards leaned against the wall on either side of a solid door.
"My name's Yarblek," Silk's friend told them as he reached the door. "Drosta's expecting me."
The guards glanced at each other, then one tapped on the door.
"That man you wanted to see is here, Your Majesty." "I send him in."
Drosta's voice was muffled.
"He is not alone," the guard advised. "It's all right. Go ahead," the guard said to Yarblek,
unlatching the door and pushing it open. The king of the Nadraks was sprawled on a rumpled bed with his arms about the thin shoulders of a pair of dirty, scantily dressed young girls with tangled hair and hopeless-looking eyes.
"Yarblek,"
the depraved monarch greeted the merchant.
"What kept you? I did not want to attract attention by following you immediately, Drosta." "I almost got sidetracked,"
Drosta leered at the 2 girls.
"Aren't they luscious?" "If you like the type,"
Yarblek shrugged.
"I prefer a little more, maturity." "Hey, that's good too," Drosta admitted. "But I love them all. I fall in love 20 times a day. Run along now, my pretties," he told the girls. "I got some business to take care of just now. I will send for you later."
The 2 girls immediately left, closing the door quietly behind them. Drosta sat up on the bed, scratching absently at one armpit. His stained and rumpled yellow doublet was unbuttoned, and his bony chest was covered with coarse black hair. He was thin, almost emaciated, and his scrawny arms looked like 2 sticks. His hair was lank and greasy, and his beard was so thin that it was little more than a few scraggly-looking black hairs sprouting from his chin. The pockmarks on his face were deep, angry red scars, and his neck and hands were covered with an unwholesome, scabby-looking rash. There was a distinctly unpleasant odor about him.
"You sure this is the man I want?" he asked Yarblek.
Garyon looked at the Nadrak king sharply. The coarseness had gone out of his voice, and his tone was incisive, direct. The tone of a man who was all business. Garyon made a few quick mental adjustments. Drosta Lacton was not at all what he seemed.
"I have known him for years, Drosta," Yarblek replied. "This is Prince Keldor of Dresnia. He is also known as Silk, and sometimes as Ambar of Kotu or Redek of Boktor. He is a thief, a swindler, and a spy. Aside from that, he's not too bad." "We are delighted to meet so famous a man," King Drosta declared. "Welcome, Prince Keldor."
"Your Majesty," Silk replied, bowing.
"I would have invited you to the palace," Drosta continued, "but I've got some house guests with the unfortunate habit of sticking their noses into my business."
He laughed dryly.
"Luckily, I found out very soon that Malorians are a priggish race. They will not follow me into places like this, so we will be able to talk freely."
He looked around at the cheap, gaudy furnishings and red draperies with a sort of amused toleration.
"Besides, I like it here."
Garyon stood with his back against the wall near the door, trying to remain as unobtrusive as possible, but Drosta's nervous eyes picked him out.
"Can he be trusted?"
the king demanded of Silk.
"Completely,"
Silk assured him.
"He's my apprentice. I am teaching him the business." "Which business? Stealing or spying?"
Silk shrugged.
"It amounts to the same thing. Yarblek says you wanted to see me. I assume that it has something to do with current matters, rather than any past misunderstandings." "You're quick, Keldor," Drosta replied approvingly. "I need your help, and I am willing to pay for it."
Silk grinned.
"Oh, I'm fond of the word pay." "So I have heard. Do you know what is going on here in Gar Og Nadrak?"
Drosta's eyes were penetrating, and his veneer of gross self-indulgence had fallen completely away. "I am in the intelligence service, Your Majesty," Silk pointed out. Drosta grunted, stood up, and went to the table where a decanter of wine and several glasses stood.
"Drink?"
he asked. "Why not?" Drosta filled 4 glasses, took one for himself, and paced nervously about the room with an angry expression.
"I don't need any of this, Keldar," he burst out. "My family spent generations, centuries, weaning Gar Og Nadrak away from the domination of the Grolums, and now they are about to drag us back into howling barbarism again. And I don't have any choice but to go along with it. I've got 250,000 Malorians roaming around at will inside my borders, and an army that I can't even count, poised just to the south. If I raise so much as one word of protest, Zakath will crush my kingdom with one fist."
"Would he really do that?" Silk asked, taking a chair at the table.
"With just about as much emotion as you will feel about swatting a fly," Drosta replied. "Have you ever met him?"
Silk shook his head.
"You are lucky," Drosta told him with a shudder. "Tar Ogas is a madman. But, much as I hate him, he is still human. Zakath is made of ice. I've got to get in touch with Rodar."
"Oh," Silk said. "That's what this is all about, then."
"You're a nice enough fellow, Keldar," Drosta told him dryly. "But I would not go to all this trouble just for the pleasure of your company. You have got to carry my message to Rodar. I've tried to get word to him, but I cannot catch up with him. He won't stay in one place long enough. How can a fat man move so cursedly fast?"
"He's deceptive," Silk said shortly. "Exactly what have you got in mind?"
"An alliance," Drosta replied bluntly. "My back is against the wall. Either I ally myself with Rodar, or I get swallowed up."
Silk carefully set down his glass. "That's a very large suggestion, Your Majesty. In the present situation, it's going to take a great deal of fast talking to arrange."
"Wait, that's why I sent for you, Keldar. We are staring at the end of the world right in the face. You have got to get Rodar and persuade him to pull his army back from the Tullish border. Make him stop this insanity before it goes too far."
"Oh, well, making my uncle do things is a little beyond my ability, King Drosta. I am flattered that you think I've got that much influence with him, but things have usually been the other way around between us."
"Don't you understand what's going on, Keldar?"
King Drosta's voice was anguished, and he gesticulated almost wildly as he spoke.
"Our only hope of survival lies in not giving the Morgos and the Malorians any kind of reason to unite. We should work to stir up trouble between them, not to provide them with a common enemy. Tar Ogas and Zakath hate each other with a passion so intense it is almost holy. There are more Morgos than grains of sand, more Malorians than stars. The Grolums can babble their gibberish about the awakening of Torak until their tongues fall out, but Tar Ogas and Zakath have taken the field for just one reason. Each of them wants to destroy the other and make himself over-king of Angarak. They are headed directly toward a war of mutual extinction. We can be rid of both of them if we just do not interfere."
"I think I see what you mean," Silk murmured.
Zakath is ferrying his Malorians across the sea of the east to his staging area near Torzelik, and Tar Ogas has the southern Mogos massed near Okoska. Inevitably, they are going to move on each other. We've got to stay out of the way. Let them fight. Make Rodar pull back before he spoils everything."
"Have you talked with the Tulls about this?"
Drosta snorted with contempt. "What is the point? I tried to explain this to King Gettel, but talking to him is like talking to a pile of manure. The Tulls are so afraid of the Grolums that all you have to do is to mention Torak's name and they'll go to pieces. Gettel is a Tull through and through. There is nothing between his ears but sand."
"There's just one problem with all of this, Drosta," Silk told the agitated monarch. "I cannot carry a message to King Rodar."
"Can't?" Drosta exploded. "What do you mean? You can't?"
"My uncle and I are not on the best of terms just now," Silk lied smoothly. "We had a little misunderstanding a few months ago, and about the first thing he would do if he saw me is to have me put in chains, and I'm almost certain things would go downhill from there."
Drosta groaned. "We are all doomed, then," he declared, seeming to slump in on himself. "You were my last hope."
"Oh, let me think a moment," Silk said. "We might be able to salvage something out of this yet." He stared at the floor, chewing absently on a fingernail, as he turned the problem over in his mind. "I can't go. That's obvious. But that doesn't mean that somebody else couldn't."
"Who else would Rodar trust?"
Drosta demanded. Silk turned to Yablek, who had been listening to the conversation intently with a worried frown. "Are you in any kind of trouble in Drasnia at the moment?" he asked.
"Not that I know of."
"All right. There is a fur dealer in Bakhtor. Galdahar's his name."
"Fat man. Sort of cross-eyed?"
Yablek asked. "Oh, that's him. Why don't you take a shipment of furs and go to Bakhtor? While you are trying to sell Galdahar the furs, tell him that the salmon run is late this year."
"I am sure that he will be fascinated to hear that."
"Oh, it's a code word," Silk explained with exaggerated patience. "As soon as you say that, he will see to it that you get into the palace to see Queen Porin."
"I've heard that she is a lovely woman," Yablek said. "But that is a long trip just to see a pretty girl. I can probably find a pretty girl just down the hall."
"You're missing the point, Yablek. Porin is Rodar's queen, and he trusts her even more than he trusts me. She will know that I sent you, and she'll pass anything you tell her on to my uncle Rodar, who will be reading Drosta's message 3 days after you ride into Bakhtor. I guarantee it."
"You'll let a woman know about all of this?" Drosta objected violently. "Galdahar, you are insane. Well, a woman safe with a secret is one who has had her tongue cut out."
Silk shook his head firmly. "Porin is in control of Drasnian intelligence right now, Drosta. She already knows most of the secrets in the world. You're never going to get an emissary through an Elorn army to Rodar, so forget that. There will be Kereks with them, and they will kill any Angrak on sight. If you want to communicate with Rodar, you're going to have to use Drasnian intelligence as an intermediary, and that means going through Porin." Drosta looked dubious.
"Maybe," he concluded after a moment's thought. "I would try anything at this point. But why should Yablek get involved? Why can't you carry my message to the Drasnian queen?"
Silk looked a trifle pained. "Oh, that wouldn't be a good idea at all, I'm afraid. Porin was rather central to my difficulties with my uncle. I am definitely unwelcome at the palace just now."
One of King Drosta's shaggy eyebrows shot up. "Hey, so that's the way it is," he laughed then. "Your reputation is well earned, I see."
He turned to Yarblek. "It is up to you, then. Make the necessary arrangements for the trip to Bakhtar."
"You already owe me money, Drosta," Yarblek replied bluntly. "The reward for bringing in Keldar, remember?" Drosta shrugged.
"Hey, write it down someplace."
Yarblek shook his head stubbornly.
"Not hardly. Let us keep your account current. You are known as a slow payer once you have got what you want."
"Yarblek," Drosta said plaintively.
"I am your king."
Yarblek inclined his head somewhat mockingly.
"I honor and respect your majesty, but business is business, after all." "I don't carry that much money with me," Drosta protested.
"Oh, that's all right, Drosta."
"I can't wait."
Yarblek crossed his arms and sat down in a large chair with the air of a man planning to stay for quite some time. The king of the Nadraks stared at him helplessly. Then the door opened, and Belgarath stepped into the room, still dressed in the rags he had worn in the tavern downstairs. There was no furtiveness about his entrance, and he moved like a man on serious business.
"Hey, what is this?"
Drosta exclaimed incredulously.
"Guards!" he bawled. "Get this drunken old man out of here."
"They are asleep, Drosta," Belgarath replied calmly. "Don't be too harsh with them, though. It's not their fault." He closed the door.
"Who are you? What do you think you are doing?" Drosta demanded. "Get out of here."
"I think you had better take a closer look, Drosta," Silk advised with a dry little chuckle. "Appearances can be deceiving sometimes, and you shouldn't be so quick to try to throw someone out. He might have something important to say to you."
"Do you know him, Keldar?"
"Oh, just about everybody in the world knows him," Silk replied. "Or of him?" Drosta's face creased into a puzzled frown, but Yarblek had started from his chair, his lean face suddenly pale.
"Drosta," he gasped. "Look at him. Think a minute. You know who he is."
Drosta stared at the shabby-looking old man, and his bulging eyes slowly opened even wider.
"You?" he blurted.
Yarblek was still gaping at Belgarath.
"He has been involved in it from the very beginning. I should have put it together down in Tol Murgos. Him, the woman, all of it." "What are you doing in Gar Og Nadrak?" Drosta asked in an awed voice.
"Just passing through, Drosta. If you're quite finished with your discussion here, I need these 2 elons. We have an appointment, and we are running a little behind schedule."
"I always thought you were a myth."
"I like to encourage that as much as I can," Belgarath told him. "It makes moving around a lot easier."
"Are you mixed up in what the Alons are doing?"
"They are acting more or less on my suggestions, yes. Baldra's keeping an eye on them."
"Can you get word to them? Tell them to disengage?"
"That won't really be necessary, Drosta. I wouldn't worry too much about Zakath and Tarogas, if I were you. There are more important things afoot than their squabbles."
"Oh, so that's what Rodar's doing,"
Drosta said in sudden comprehension.
"Is it really that late?"
"It is even later than you think," the old sorcerer answered. He crossed to the table and poured himself some of Drosta's wine. "Torek's already stirring. The whole matter is likely to be settled before the snow flies."
"This is going too far, Belgarath. I might try to maneuver my way around Tarogas and Zakath, but I am not going to cross Torak."
He turned decisively toward the door. "Don't do anything rash, Drosta," Belgarath advised him calmly, sitting in a chair and taking a sip of his wine. "Grolums can be most unreasonable, and the fact that I am here in Nadrak could only be viewed as the result of some collusion on your part." Then have you bent backward over an altar, and your heart sizzling in the coals before you ever got the chance to explain, king or no king?"
Drosta froze in his tracks, his pock-marked face going very pale. For a moment he seemed to be struggling with himself. Then his shoulders slumped, and his resolution seemed to wilt.
"You have got me by the throat, haven't you, Belgarath?" he said with a short laugh. "You've managed to make me outsmart myself, and now you are going to use that to force me to betray the god of Engarak. Are you really all that fond of him?" "Nobody is fond of Torak. I'm afraid of him. And that is a better reason to stay on the good side of him than any sentimental attachment. If he wakes up—" The king of the Nadraks shuddered.
"Have you ever given much thought to the kind of world we would have if he did not exist?" Belgarath suggested.
"That is too much to even wish for. He is a god. No one can hope to defeat him. He is too powerful for that."
"There are things more powerful than gods, Drosta. 2 that I can think of offhand, and those 2 are rushing toward a final meeting. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to put yourself between them at this point."
But something else had occurred to Drosta. He turned slowly with a look of stunned incredulity and stared directly at Garion. He shook his head and wiped at his eyes, like a man trying to clear away a fog. Garion became painfully aware of the great sword strapped across his back. Drosta's bulging eyes widened even more as the realization of what he was seeing erased the orb's suggestion that his brain not record what stood in plain sight before him. His expression became awed, and desperate hope dawned on his ugly face.
Your Majesty,"
he stammered, bowing with profound respect.
"Your Majesty,"
Garion replied, politely inclining his head.
"It looks as if I am forced to wish you good luck," Drosta said in a quiet voice. "Despite what Belgarath says, I think you are going to need it."
"Thank you, King Drosta,"
Garion said.
Chapter 6.
"Do you think we can trust Drosta?"
Garion asked Silk as they followed Belgarath along the garbage-littered alley behind the tavern.
"Probably about as far as we could throw him," Silk replied. "He was honest about one thing, though. His back is to the wall. That might make him bargain with Rodar in good faith, initially, at least."
When they reached the street at the end of the alley, Belgarath glanced up once at the evening sky.
"We had better hurry. I want to get out of the city before they close the gates. I left our horses in the thicket a mile or so outside the walls."
"You went back for them?" Silk sounded a little surprised.
"Of course I did. I don't plan to walk all the way to the Morandland."
He led them up the street away from the river. They reached the city gates in fading light just as the guards were preparing to close them for the night. One of the Nadrak soldiers raised his hand as if to bar their way, then apparently changed his mind and motioned them through irritably, muttering curses under his breath. The huge tar-smeared gate boomed shut behind them, and there was the clinking rattle of heavy chains from inside as the bolts were thrown and locked. Garion glanced up once at the carved face of Torak which brooded down at them from above the gate, then deliberately turned his back.
"Are we likely to be followed?"
Silk asked Belgarath as they walked along the dirt highway leading away from the city.
"I wouldn't be very surprised," Belgarath replied. "Drosta knows, or suspects, a great deal about what we are doing. Malorian Grolums are very subtle, and they can pick the thoughts out of his head without his knowing it. That's probably why they don't bother to follow him when he goes off on his little excursions."
Shouldn't you take some steps? Silk suggested, as they moved through the gathering twilight.
We're getting a bit too close to Meloria to be making any unnecessary noise, Belgariad told him. Zadar can hear me, moving around from a long way off, and Torak's only dozing now. I would rather not take the chance of waking him up with any more loud clatter.
They walked along the highway toward the shadowy line of rank undergrowth at the edge of the open fields surrounding the city. The sound of frogs from the marshy ground near the river was very loud in the twilight.
Torak isn't really asleep anymore, then? Garion asked finally.
He had harbored somewhere at the back of his mind the vague hope that they might be able to creep up on the sleeping god and catch him unaware.
No, not really, his grandfather replied. The sound of your hand touching the orb shook the whole world. Not even Torak could sleep through that. He isn't really awake yet, but he's not entirely asleep either.
Did it really make all that much noise? Silk asked curiously.
They probably heard it on the other side of the universe. Come, I left the horses over there.
The old man pointed toward a shadowy willow grove several hundred yards to the left of the road. From behind them, there was the rattle of heavy chains, startling the frogs into momentary silence.
They're opening the gate, Silk said.
They wouldn't do that unless somebody gave them an official reason to.
Let's hurry, Belgariad said.
The horses stirred and nickered as the three of them pushed their way through the rustling willows in the rapidly descending darkness. They led the horses out of the grove, mounted, and rode back toward the highway.
They know we're out here somewhere. There's not much point being coy about it.
Just a second, Silk said. He dismounted and rummaged through one of the canvas bags tied to their pack-horse. He pulled something out of the bag, then climbed back on his horse.
Let's go, then.
They pushed into a gallop, thudding along the dirt road under a starry, moonless sky toward the denser shadows where the forest rose at the edge of the scrubby, burned-off expanse surrounding the Nadrak capital.
Can you see them?
Belgariad called to Silk, who was bringing up the rear and looking back over his shoulder.
I think so, Silk shouted back. They're about a mile behind.
That's too close.
I'll take care of it as soon as we get into the woods,
Silk replied confidently. The dark forest loomed closer and closer as they galloped along the hard-packed road. Garion could smell the trees now. They plunged into the black shadows under the trees and felt that slight extra warmth that always lies in a forest. Silk reined in sharply.
Keep going,
he told them, swinging out of his saddle.
I'll catch up.
Belgariad and Garion rode on, slowing a bit in order to pick the road out of the darkness. After several minutes, Silk caught up with them.
Listen,
the little man said, pulling his horse to a stop. His teeth flashed in the shadows as he grinned.
They're coming,
Garion warned urgently as he heard a rumble of hoofs.
Hadn't we better?
Listen, Silk whispered sharply. From behind there were several startled exclamations and the heavy sound of men falling. A horse squealed and ran off somewhere. Silk laughed wickedly.
I think that we can press on, he said gaily. They will be delayed for a bit while they round up their horses.
What did you do?
Silk shrugged. I stretched a rope across the road, about chest-high on a mounted man. Oh, it's an old trick, but sometimes the old tricks are the best. They'll have to be more cautious now, so we should be able to lose them by morning.
Let's go, then, Belgariad said.
Where are we headed? Silk asked as they moved into a canter.
We'll make directly for the North Range, the old man replied. Too many people know we're here, so let's get to the land of the Morindom as soon as we can.
If they're really after us, they'll follow us all the way, won't they?
Garion asked, looking back nervously.
I don't think so, Belgariad told him. They'll be a long way behind by the time we get there. I don't think they'll risk going into Morand territory just to follow a cold trail.
Is it that dangerous, Grandfather?
The Morindom do nasty things to strangers if they catch them.
Garion thought about that.
Won't we be strangers too? To the Merindum, I mean.
I'll take care of that when we get there.
They galloped on through the remainder of the velvety night, leaving their now cautious pursuers far behind. The blackness beneath the trees was dotted with the pale, winking glow of fireflies, and crickets chirped interminably. As the first light of morning began to filter through the forest, they reached the edge of another burned-off area, and Belgariad reined in to peer cautiously out at the rank scrub, dotted here and there with charred snags.
"We'd better have something to eat," he suggested. "The horses need some rest, and we can catch a bit of sleep before we go on."
He looked around in the gradually increasing light.
"Let's get away from the road."
He turned his horse and led them off along the edge of the burn. After several 100 yards, they reached a small clearing that jutted out into the coarse brush. A spring trickled water into a mossy pool at the very edge of the trees, and the grass in the clearing was intensely green. The outer edge of the opening was hemmed in by brambles and a tangle of charred limbs.
"This looks like a good place," Belgariad decided.
"Not really," Silk disagreed. He was staring at a crudely squared-off block of stone standing in the center of the clearing. There were ugly black stains running down the sides of the stone.
"For our purposes it is," the old man replied. "The altars of Torak are generally avoided, and we don't particularly want company."
They dismounted at the edge of the trees, and Belgariad began rummaging through one of the packs for bread and dried meat. Gerion was in a curiously abstracted mood. He was tired, and his weariness made him a bit light-headed. Quite deliberately, he walked across the springy turf to the blood-stained altar. He stared at it, his eyes meticulously recording details without considering their implications. The blackened stone sat solidly in the center of the clearing, casting no shadow in the pale dawn light. It was an old altar, and had not been used recently. The stains that had sunk into the pores of the rock were black with age, and the bones littering the ground around it were half sunk into the earth, covered with a greenish patina of moss. A scurrying spider darted into the vacant eye socket of a mossy skull, seeking refuge in the dark, vaulted emptiness. Many of the bones were broken and showed the marks of the small, sharp teeth of forest scavengers who would feed on anything that was dead. A cheap, tarnished silver brooch lay with its chain tangled about a lumpy vertebra, and not far away a brass buckle, green with verdigris, still clung to a bit of mouldering leather. "Oh, come away from that thing, Gerion," Silk told him, with a note of revulsion in his voice. "It sort of helps to look at it," Gerion replied quite calmly, still staring at the altar and the bones. "It gives me something to think about besides being afraid." He squared his shoulders, and his great sword shifted on his back. "I don't really think the world needs this sort of thing. Maybe it's time somebody did something about it." When he turned around, Belgariad was looking at him, his wise old eyes narrowed.
"It's a start," the sorcerer observed. "Let's eat, get some sleep."
They took a quick breakfast, picketed their horses, and rolled themselves in their blankets under some bushes at the edge of the clearing. Not even the presence of the Grolem altar, nor the peculiar resolve it had stirred in him, was enough to keep Gerion from falling asleep immediately. It was almost noon when he awoke, pulled from sleep by a faint whispering sound in his mind. He sat up quickly, looking around to find the source of the disturbance, but neither the forest nor the brush-choked burn seemed to hold any threat. Belgariad stood not far away, looking up at the summer sky, where a large blue-banded hawk was circling.
"What are you doing here?"
The old sorcerer did not speak aloud, but rather cast the question at the sky with his mind. The hawk spiraled down to the clearing, flared its wings to avoid the altar, and landed on the turf. He looked directly at Belgariad with fierce yellow eyes, then shimmered and seemed to blur. When the shimmering was gone, the misshapen sorcerer Belden stood in his place. He was still as ragged, dirty, and irritable as he had been the last time Gerion had seen him. Is this all the farther you've managed to come?" he demanded harshly of Belgariad. "What have you been doing? Stopping at every tavern along the way?"
"We ran into a small delay," Belgariad replied calmly.
Belden grunted with a sour look. "If you keep dawdling along like this, it'll take you the rest of the year to get to Thol Mishrak."
"We'll get there, Belden. You worry too much."
"Somebody has to. You're being followed, you know."
"How far back are they?"
5 leagues or so."
Belgariad shrugged. "That's far enough. They'll give up when we get to Moranland."
"What if they don't?"
"Have you been spending time with Bulgara lately?" Belgariad asked dryly. "I thought I had gotten away from all of the what-ifs."
Belden shrugged, a gesture made grotesque by the lump on his back. "I saw her last week," he reported. "She has some interesting plans for you, you know."
"She came to the Vale?"
Belgariad sounded surprised. Passed through. She was with that red-haired girl's army." Garion threw off his blanket. "With whose army?" he demanded.
"What's going on down there?"
Belgariad asked sharply. Belden scratched at his tangled hair. "I never really got the straight of it," he admitted. "All I know is that the Helorns are following that little red-headed Tonedran. She calls herself the Raven Queen, whatever that means." "Sinedra?" Garion was incredulous, though for some reason he knew that he should not be. "I guess she went through Arindia like a pestilence," Belden continued. "After she passed, there wasn't an able-bodied man left in the kingdom. Then she went on down into Tol Nedra and goaded her father into convulsions. I didn't know that he was subject to fits."
"It crops up in the Baroon line once in a while," Belgariad said. "Nothing all that serious, but they try to keep it quiet."
"Anyway," the hunchback went on, "while Ran Boroon was still frothing at the mouth, his daughter stole his legions. She's persuaded about half the world to take up arms and follow her." He gave Garion a quizzical look. "You're supposed to marry her, aren't you?" Garion nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Belden grinned suddenly. "You might want to give some thought to running away." "Sinedra?" Garion blurted again. "His wits seem a bit scrambled," Belden observed.
"He's been under a strain. And his nerves aren't too good just now. Are you going back to the Vale?"
Belden nodded. "The twins and I are going to join Bulgara when the campaign starts. She might need some help if the Grolums come at her in force."
"Campaign?" Belgariad exclaimed. "What campaign? I told them just to march up and down and make a lot of noise. I specifically told them not to invade."
They ignored you, it seems. Helorns aren't noted for restraint in such matters. Apparently they got together and decided to take steps. The fat one seems fairly intelligent. He wants to get a Carrick fleet into the Sea of the East to commit a few constructive atrocities on Malorian shipping. The rest of it seems to be pretty much diversionary."
Belgariad started to swear. "You can't let them out of your sight for a single instant," he raged. "How could Bulgara lend herself to this idiocy?"
"The plan does have a certain merit, Belgariad. The more Malorians they drown now, the fewer we have to fight later."
"We never planned to fight them, Belden. The Angrax won't unite unless Torak comes back to weld them together again, or unless they are faced with a common enemy. We just talked with Drustalach-Thun, the Nadrak king. He's so sure that the Murgos and the Malorians are about to go to war with each other that he wants to ally himself with the West, just to get clear of it. When you get back, see if you can talk some sense into Rodar and Anheg. I have got enough problems already."
"Your problems are only starting, Belgariad. The twins had a visitation a couple of days ago."
"A what?"
Belden shrugged. "Well, what else would you call it? They were working on something quite unrelated to all of this. and the pair of 'em suddenly went into a trance and began to babble at me. At first they were just repeating that gibberish from the Mrin Codex, you know the place, where the Mrin prophet's mind broke down and he degenerated into animal noises for a while. Anyway, they went back over that part. Only this time it came out coherently.
What did it say? Belgariad demanded, his eyes burning.
Are you sure you want to know?
Of course I want to know.
All right. Went like this. Behold, the heart of the stone shall relent, and the beauty that was destroyed shall be restored, and the eye that is not shall be made whole again.
Belgariad stared at him.
That's it. That's it, Belden told him.
But what does it mean?
Just what it says, Belgarian. For some reason, the orb is going to restore Torak.
Garion began to tremble as the full impact of Belden's words struck him. Torak's going to win, then, he said numbly.
It didn't say anything about winning or losing, Belgarian, Belden corrected him. All it said was that the orb is going to undo what it did to Torak when he used it to crack the world. Doesn't say anything about why.
That's always been the trouble with the prophecy, Belgariad observed. It can mean any one of a dozen different things.
Or all of them, Belden added. That's what makes it so difficult to understand sometimes. We tend to concentrate on just one thing, but prophecy includes everything at the same time. I'll work on it and see if I can wring some sense out of it. If I come up with anything, I'll let you know. I'd better be getting back.
He leaned slightly forward and curled his arms out in a vaguely wing-like gesture.
Watch out for the Merindum, he told Belgariad. You're a fair sorcerer, but magic's altogether different. Sometimes it gets away from you.
I think I can handle it if I have to, Belgariad replied tartly.
Maybe. If you can manage to stay sober.
He shimmered back into the form of the hawk, beat his wings twice, and spiraled up out of the clearing and into the sky. Garion watched him until he was only a circling speck. That was a strange visit, Silk said, rolling out of his blankets. It looks as if quite a bit has been going on since we left.
And none of it very good, Belgariad added sourly. Let's get moving. We're really going to have to hurry now. If Anheg gets his fleet into the Sea of the East and starts sinking Malorian troop ships, Zakath might decide to march north and come across the land bridge. If we don't get there first, it could get very crowded up there.
The old man scowled darkly.
I'd like to put my hands on your uncle just about now, he added. I'd sweat a few pounds off of him.
They quickly saddled their horses and rode back along the edge of the sunlit forest toward the road leading north. Despite the rather lame assurances of the two sorcerers, Garion rode slumped in despair. They were going to lose, and Torak was going to kill him. Stop feeling so sorry for yourself, the inner voice told him finally. Why did you get me into this? Garion demanded bitterly. We have discussed that before. He's going to kill me. What gives you that idea? That's what the prophecy said. Garion stopped abruptly as a thought occurred to him. You said it yourself. You are the prophecy, aren't you? It's a misleading term. And I didn't say anything about winning or losing. Well, isn't that what it means? No. It means exactly what it says. Well, what else could it mean? You're getting more stubborn every day. Stop worrying so much about meanings. Just do what you have to do. You almost had it right back there. If all you're going to do is talk in riddles, why bother with it at all? Why go to all the trouble of saying things that nobody's able to understand? Because it's necessary to say it. The word determines the event. The word puts limits on the event and shapes it. Without the word, the event is merely a random happening. That's the whole purpose of what you call prophecy. To separate the significant from the random.
I don't understand.
I didn't think you would. But you asked, after all. Now, stop worrying about it. It has nothing to do with you.
Garion wanted to protest, but the voice was gone. The conversation, however, had made him feel a little better. Not much, but a little. To take his mind off of it, he pulled his horse in beside Belgariad's as they re-entered the forest on the far side of the burn.
Exactly who are the Morindom, Grandfather? Everybody keeps talking about them as if they were terribly dangerous.
They are, Belgariad replied, but you can get through their country if you are careful.
Are they on Torak's side?
The Morindom are not on anyone's side. They don't even live in the same world with us.
I don't follow that.
The Morindom are like the Ulgos used to be, before Ul accepted them. There were several groups of godless ones. They all wandered off in various directions. The Ulgos went to the west, the Morindom went north. Other groups went south or east and disappeared.
Why didn't they just stay where they were?
They couldn't. There's a kind of compulsion involved in the decisions of the gods. Anyway, the Ulgos finally found themselves a god. The Morindom did not. The compulsion to remain separated from other people is still there. They live in the treeless emptiness up there beyond the North Range. Small nomadic bands, mostly.
What did you mean when you said they don't live in the same world with us?
Their world is a pretty terrible place for a Morand. A demon-haunted place. They worship devils, and they live more in dreams than they do in reality. Their society is dominated by the dreamers and the magicians.
There aren't really any devils, are there?
Garion asked skeptically.
Oh, yes. The devils are very real.
Where do they come from?
Belgariad shrugged. I haven't any idea. They do exist, though. And they are completely evil. The Morindom control them by the use of magic.
Magic? Is that different from what we do?
Quite a bit. We are sorcerers. At least that's what we are called. What we do involves the will and the word, but that's not the only way to do things.
I don't quite follow.
It's not really all that complicated, Garion. There are several ways to tamper with the normal order of things. Vorda is a witch. What she does involves the use of spirits, usually benign, mischievous sometimes, but not actually wicked. A magician uses devils, evil spirits.
Isn't that sort of dangerous?
Belgariad nodded. Very dangerous. The magician tries to control the demon with spells, formulas, incantations, symbols, mystic diagrams, that sort of thing. As long as he does not make any mistakes, the demon is his absolute slave, and has to do what he tells it to do. The demon does not want to be a slave, so it keeps looking for a way to break the spell.
What happens if it does?
It generally devours the magician on the spot. That happens rather frequently. If you lose your concentration or summon a demon too strong for you, you're in trouble.
What did Belden mean when he said that you weren't very good at magic?
I've never spent that much time trying to learn about it, the old sorcerer replied. I have alternatives, after all, and magic is dangerous, not very dependable.
Don't use it, then, Silk suggested.
I hadn't really planned to. Usually, the threat of magic is enough to keep the Morindom at a distance. Actual confrontations are rather rare.
I can see why.
After we get through the North Range, we'll disguise ourselves. There are a number of markings and symbols that will make the Morindom avoid us.
That sounds promising.
Of course, we have to get there first, the old man pointed out. Let's pick up the pace a bit. We've still got a long way to go."
And he pushed his horse into a gallop. Chapter 7. They rode hard for the better part of a week, moving steadily northward and avoiding the scattered settlements which dotted the Nadrak forest. Geryon noticed that the nights grew steadily shorter. By the time they reached the foothills of the North Range, darkness had virtually disappeared. Evening and morning merged into a few hours of luminous twilight as the sun dipped briefly below the horizon before bursting into view once more. The North Range marked the upper edge of the Nadrak forest. It was not so much a mountainous region as it was a string of peaks, a long finger of up-thrusting terrain reaching out toward the east from the broad ranges that formed the spine of the continent. As they rode up a scarcely defined trail toward a saddle that stretched between two snowy peaks, the trees around them grew more stunted and finally disappeared entirely. Beyond that point, there would be no more trees. Belgariad stopped at the edge of one of these last groves and cut a half-dozen long saplings. The wind that came down off of the peaks had a bitter chill to it, and the arid smell of perpetual winter. When they reached the boulder-strewn summit, Geryon looked out for the first time at the immense plain stretching below. The plain, unmarked by trees, was covered with tall grass that bent before the vagrant wind in long, undulating waves. Rivers wandered aimlessly across the emptiness, and 1,000 shallow lakes and ponds scattered blue and glistening under a northern sun toward the horizon. "How far does it reach?" Geryon asked quietly.
"From here to the polar ice," Belgariad replied. "Several hundred leagues."
"And no one lives out there but the Morindom?"
"Nobody wants to. For most of the year it's buried in snow and darkness. You can go for 6 months up here without ever seeing the sun."
They rode down the rocky slope toward the plain and found a low-roofed shallow cave at the base of the granite cliff that seemed to be the demarcation line between the mountains and the foothills.
"We'll stop here for a while,"
Belgariad told them, reining in his tired mount.
"We have got some preparations to make, and the horses need some rest."
They were all kept quite busy for the next several days while Belgariad radically altered their appearance. Silk set crude traps among the maze of rabbit runs twisting through the tall grass, and Geryon roamed the foothills in search of certain tuberous roots and a peculiar-smelling white flower. Belgariad sat at the mouth of the cave, fashioning various implements from his saplings. The roots Geryon had gathered yielded a dark brown stain, and Belgariad carefully applied it to their skin.
"The Morindom are dark-skinned,"
he explained as he sat painting Silk's arms and back with the stain.
"Somewhat darker than the Tonedrons or Nissans. This will wear off after a few weeks, but it will last long enough to get us through."
After he had stained all of their skins into swarthiness, he crushed the odd-smelling flowers to produce a jet-black ink.
"Silk's hair is the right color already," he said, "and mine will get by, but Geryon's just won't do."
He diluted some of the ink with water and dyed Geryon's sandy hair deep black.
"Yeah, that's better,"
he grunted when he had finished.
"And there's enough left for the tattoos."
"Tattoos?" Geryon asked, startled at the thought.
"The Morindom decorate themselves extensively."
"Will it hurt?"
"We're not really going to tattoo ourselves, Geryon," Belgariad told him with a pained look. "They take too long to heal. Besides, I'm afraid your aunt would go into hysterics if I took you back to her with designs engraved all over you. This will last long enough for us to get through Morindland. It will wear off. Eventually."
Silk was sitting cross-legged in front of the cave, looking for all the world like a tailor as he sewed fresh rabbit pelts to their clothing. "Won't they start to smell after a few days?" Geryon asked, wrinkling his nose. "Probably," Silk admitted. "But I don't have time to cure the pelts." Later,
as Belgarath was carefully drawing the tattoos on their faces, he explained the guise they were going to assume.
Geryon will be the quester.
What's that?
Don't move your face, Belgarath told him, frowning as he drew lines under Geryon's eyes with a raven feather quill. The quest is a Morend ritual. It is customary for a young Morend of a certain rank to undertake a quest before he assumes a position of authority in his clan. You will wear a white fur headband and carry that red spear I fixed up for you. It is ceremonial, so don't try to stab anyone with it. That would be very bad form.
I'll remember that.
We will disguise your sword to look like some sort of relic or something. A magician might see, past the orb's suggestion, that it's not there, depending on how good he is. One other thing. The quester is absolutely forbidden to speak under any circumstances, so keep your mouth shut. Silk will be your dreamer. He will wear a white fur band on his left arm. Dreamers speak in riddles and gibberish for the most part. They tend to fall into trances and have fits. He glanced over at Silk. Do you think that you can handle that?
Oh, trust me, Silk replied, grinning.
Not very likely, Belgarath grunted in reply. I will be Geryon's magician. I will carry a staff with a horned skull on it. That'll make most Morindom avoid us.
Most? Silk asked quickly.
It is considered bad manners to interfere with a quest. But it happens now and then.
The old man looked critically at Geryon's tattoos.
Good enough,
he said, and turned to Silk with his quill. When it was all done, the three of them were scarcely recognizable. The markings the old man had carefully drawn on their arms and faces were not pictures so much as they were designs. Their faces had been changed into hideous devil masks, and the exposed parts of their bodies were covered with symbols etched in black ink. They wore fur-covered trousers and vests and bone necklaces clattering about their necks. Their stained arms and shoulders were bared and intricately marked. Then Belgarath went down into the valley lying just below the cave, seeking for something. It did not take his probing mind long to find what he needed. As Geryon watched with revulsion, the old man casually violated a grave. He dug up a grinning human skull and carefully tapped the dirt out of it.
I'll need some horns, he told Geryon. Deer horns, not too large, fairly well matched.
He squatted, fierce-looking in his furs and tattoos, and began to scrub at the skull with handfuls of dry sand. There were weather-bleached deer horns lying here and there in the tall grass, since the deer of the region shed their antlers each winter. Geryon gathered a dozen or so and returned to the cave to find his grandfather boring a pair of holes in the top of the skull. He critically examined the horns Geryon had brought him, selected a pair of them, and screwed them down into the holes. The grating sound of horn against bone set Geryon's teeth on edge.
What do you think? Belgarath asked, holding up the horned skull.
It's grotesque,
Geryon shuddered. Yes, that was the general idea, the old man replied.
He attached the skull firmly to the top of a long staff, decorated it with several feathers, and then rose to his feet.
Let's pack up and leave, he said.
They rode down through the treeless foothills and out into the bending, waist-high grass as the sun swung down toward the southwestern horizon, dipping briefly behind the peaks of the range that they had just crossed. The smell of the uncured pelts Silk had sewn to their clothing was not very pleasant, and Geryon did his best not to look at the hideously altered skull surmounting Belgarath's staff as they rode.
"We're being watched,"
Silk mentioned rather casually, after an hour or so of riding.
"I was sure that we would be," Belgarath replied. "Just keep going."
Their first meeting with the Morindom came just as the sun rose. They had paused on the sloping gravel bank of a meandering stream to water their mounts, and a dozen or so fur-clad riders, their dark faces tattooed into devil masks,
cantered up to the opposite bank, then stopped. They did not speak, but looked hard at the identifying marks Belgariad had so painstakingly contrived. After a brief, whispered consultation, they turned their horses and rode back away from the stream. Several minutes later, one came galloping back, carrying a bundle wrapped in a fox skin. He paused, dropped the bundle on the bank of the stream, then rode off again without looking back.
"What was that all about?"
Garion asked.
"The bundle is a gift, of sorts," Belgariad answered. "It's an offering to any devils who might be accompanying us. Go, pick it up."
"What's in it?"
"A bit of this, a bit of that. I wouldn't open it if I were you. You're forgetting that you're not supposed to talk."
"There's nobody around,"
Garion replied, turning his head this way and that, looking for any sign of their being watched.
"Don't be too sure of that," the old man replied. "There could be 100 of them hiding in the grass. Go, pick up the gift, and we'll move along. They're polite enough, but they will be a lot happier when we take our devils out of their territory."
They rode on across the flat, featureless plain with a cloud of flies drawn by the smell of their untamed fur garments plaguing them. Their next meeting, several days later, was less congenial. They had moved into a hilly region where huge, rounded white boulders rose out of the grass and where shaggy-coated wild oxen with great, sweeping horns grazed. A high overcast had moved in, and the gray sky diffused the light, making the brief twilight that marked the passage of one day into the next an only slightly perceptible darkening. They were riding down a gentle slope toward a large lake, which lay like a sheet of lead under the cloudy sky, when there suddenly arose from the tall grass all around them tattooed and fur-clad warriors holding long spears and short bows that appeared to be made of bone. Garion reined in sharply, and he looked at Belgariad for instruction.
"Just look straight at them," his grandfather told him quietly. "And remember that you are not permitted to speak."
"More of them coming," Silk said tersely, jerking his chin toward the crest of a nearby hill, where perhaps a dozen Morindum, mounted on paint-decorated ponies, were approaching at a walk.
"Let me do the talking,"
Belgariad said.
"Oh, gladly."
The man in the lead of the mounted group was burlier than most of his companions, and the black tattooing on his face had been outlined with red and blue, marking him as a man of some significance in his clan, and making the devil mask of his features all the more hideous. He carried a large wooden club, painted with strange symbols and inlaid with rows of sharp teeth taken from various animals. The way he carried it indicated that it was more a badge of office than a weapon. He rode without a saddle and with a single bridle strap. He pulled his pony to a stop, perhaps 30 yards away.
"Where have you come? Into the lands of the Weasel clan?"
he demanded abruptly. His accent was strange, and his eyes were flat with hostility. Belgariad threw himself up indignantly.
"Surely the head man of the Weasel clan has seen the quest mark before," he replied coldly. "We have no interest in the lands of the Weasel clan, but follow the commands of the devil spirit of the Wolf clan in the quest he has laid upon us." "I have not heard of this Wolf clan," the headman replied. "Where are their lands?" "To the west," Belgariad replied. "We have traveled for 2 waxings and wanings of the moon spirit to reach this place."
The headman seemed impressed by that. A Morind, with long white braids and with a thin, dirty-looking beard, drew his pony in beside that of the headman. In his right hand he carried a staff surmounted by the skull of a large bird. The gaping beak of the skull had been decorated with teeth, giving it a ferocious appearance.
"What is the name of the devil spirit of the Wolf clan?" he demanded. "I may know him."
"That is doubtful, magician of the Weasel clan, Belgarath answered politely. "He seldom goes far from his people. In any case, I cannot speak his name, since he has forbidden it to any but the dreamers."
"Can you say what his aspect is, and his attributes?"
the white-braided magician asked. Silk made a long, gurgling sound in the back of his throat, stiffened in his saddle, and rolled his eyes gruesomely back in his head until only the whites showed. With a convulsive jerking motion, he thrust both arms into the air.
"Beware the devil, Ogrinja, who stalks unseen behind us," he intoned in his hollow, oracular voice. "I have seen his three-eyed face and his 100-fanged mouth in my dreams. The eye of mortal man may not behold him, but his 7-clawed hands reach out even now to rend apart all who would stand in the path of his chosen quester, the spear-bearer of the wolf clan. I have seen him feed in my nightmares. The ravener approaches, and he hungers for man-meat. Flee his hunger." He shuddered then, dropping his arms and slumping forward in his saddle, as if suddenly exhausted.
"You've been here before, I see," Belgarath muttered under his breath. "Try to restrain your creativity, though. Remember that I might have to produce what you dream up."
Silk cast him a sidelong wink. His description of the devil had made a distinct impression on the Morindom. The mounted men looked about nervously, and those standing in the waist-high grass moved involuntarily closer together, grasping their weapons in trembling hands. Then a thin Morind with a white fur band around his left arm pushed through the cluster of frightened warriors. His right leg ended in a clubfoot, and he lurched grotesquely as he walked. He fixed Silk with a glare of pure hatred, then threw both hands wide, quivering and jerking. His back arched, and he toppled over, threshing in the grass in the throes of an apparent seizure. He went completely stiff, and then he started to speak.
"The devil spirit of the Weasel clan, dread Horja, speaks to me. He demands to know why the devil Ogrinja sent his quester into the lands of the Weasel clan. The devil Horja is too awful to look upon. He has 4 eyes and 110 teeth, and each of his 6 hands has 8 claws. He feeds on the bellies of men, and he hungers."
"An imitator," Silk sniffed disdainfully, his head still down. "He can't even think up his own dream." The magician of the Weasel clan gave the dreamer lying supine in the grass a look of disgust, then turned back to Belgarath.
"The devil spirit Horja defies the devil spirit Ogrinja," he declared. "He bids him to be gone, or he will rip out the belly of the quester of Ogrinja."
Belgarath swore under his breath. "What now?" Silk muttered.
"I have to fight him," Belgarath replied sourly. "That's what this was leading up to from the beginning. Whitebraids there is trying to make a name for himself. He has probably been attacking every magician who crosses his path."
"Can you handle him?"
"We're about to find out."
Belgarath slid out of his saddle.
"I warn you to stand aside," he boomed, "lest I loose the hunger of our devil spirit upon you."
With the tip of his staff he drew a circle on the ground, and a 5-pointed star within the circle. Grimly, he stepped into the center of the design. The white-braided magician of the Weasel clan sneered, and also slid off of his pony. Quickly he drew a similar symbol on the ground and stepped into its protection. "That's it," Silk muttered to Garion. "Once the symbols are drawn, neither one can back down." Belgariad and the white-braided magician had each begun muttering incantations in a language Geryon had never heard, brandishing their skull-surmounted staves at each other. The dreamer of the Weasel clan, suddenly realizing that he was in the middle of the impending battle, miraculously recovered from his seizure, scrambled to his feet, and lurched away with a terrified expression. The headman, trying to maintain his dignity, carefully backed his pony out of the immediate vicinity of the two muttering old men. Atop a large white boulder, 20 yards or so to the left of the two magicians, there was a shimmering disturbance in the air, somewhat like heat waves rising from a red tile roof on a hot day. The movement caught Geryon's eye, and he stared in puzzlement at the strange phenomenon. As he watched, the shimmering became more pronounced, and it seemed that the shattered pieces of a rainbow infused it, flickering, shifting, undulating in waves, almost like a very hued flame rising from an invisible fire. As Geryon watched, fascinated, a second shimmering became apparent, rising above the tall grass off to the right. The second disturbance also began to gather shards of color into itself. As he stared, first at one, then at the other, Geryon saw, or imagined that he saw, a shape beginning to emerge in the center of each. The shapes at first were amorphous, shifting, changing, gathering form from the coruscating colors flashing about them in the shimmering air. Then it seemed that the shapes, having reached a certain point, flashed to completion, coalescing quite suddenly with a great rushing together, and two towering forms faced each other, snarling and slathering with mindless hatred. Each stood as high as a house, and their shoulders bulked wide. Their skins were multi-hued, with waves of color rippling through them. The one standing in the grass had a third eye glaring balefully from between its other two, and his great arms ended in 7 clawed hands, stretched out with a hideously hungry curving. His jutting, muzzle-like mouth gaped wide, filled with row upon row of needle-like teeth, as he roared a thunderous howl of hatred and dreadful hunger. Crouched upon the other boulder stood another. He had a great cluster of shoulders at the top of his trunk, and a nest of long, scaly arms that writhed out in all directions like snakes, each arm terminating in a widespread, many-clawed hand. 2 sets of eyes, one atop the other, glared insanely from beneath heavy brow ridges, and his muzzle, like that of the other figure, sprouted a forest of teeth. He raised that awful face and bellowed, his jaws drooling foam. But even as the two monsters glared at each other, there seemed to be a kind of writhing struggle going on inside them. Their skins rippled, and large moving lumps appeared in odd places on their chests and sides. Geryon had the peculiar feeling that there was something else, something quite different and perhaps even worse, trapped inside of each apparition. Growling, the two devils advanced upon each other, but despite their apparent eagerness to fight, they seemed almost driven, whipped toward the struggle. It was as if there was a dreadful reluctance in them, and their grotesque faces jerked this way and that, each snarling first at his opponent and then at the magician who controlled him. That reluctance, Geryon perceived, stemmed from something deep inside the nature of each devil. It was the enslavement, the compulsion to do the bidding of another that they hated. The chains of spell and incantation in which Belgariad and the white-braided Morind had bound them were an intolerable agony, and there were whimpers of that agony mingled with their snarls. Belgariad was sweating. Droplets of perspiration trickled down his dark, stained face. The incantations which held the devil Akrinja locked within the apparition he had created to bind it rippled endlessly from his tongue. The slightest faltering of either the words or the image he had formed in his mind would break his power over the beast that he had summoned, and it would turn upon him. Writhing like things attempting to tear themselves apart from within, Akrinja and Horja closed on each other, grappling, clawing, tearing out chunks of scaly flesh with their awful jaws. The earth shuddered beneath them as they fought. Too stunned to even be afraid, Garion watched the savage struggle. As he watched, he noted a peculiar difference between the two apparitions. Ogrenja was bleeding from his wounds, a strange dark blood so deep red as to be almost black. Horja, however, did not bleed. Chunks ripped from his arms and shoulders were like bits of wood. The white-braided magician saw that difference as well, and his eyes grew suddenly afraid. His voice became shrill as he desperately cast incantations at Horja, struggling to keep the devil under his control. The moving lumps beneath Horja's skin became larger, more agitated. The vast devil broke free from Ogrenja and stood, his chest heaving, and a dreadful hope burning in his eyes. Whitebraids was screaming now. The incantations tumbled from his mouth, faltering and stumbling, and then one unpronounceable formula tangled his tongue. Desperately he tried it again, and once again it stuck in his teeth. With a bellow of triumph, the devil Horja straightened and seemed to explode. Bits and fragments of scaly hide flew in all directions as the monster shuddered free of the illusion which had bound him. He had 2 great arms and an almost human face, surmounted by a pair of curving, needle-pointed horns. He had hooves instead of feet, and his grayish skin dripped slime. He turned slowly, and his burning eyes fixed on the gibbering magician.
"Horja!"
the white-braided Morin shrieked.
"I command you!"
The words faltered as he gaped in horror at the devil which had suddenly escaped his control.
"Horja, I am your master."
But Horja was already stalking toward him, his great hoofs crushing the grass, as step by step he moved toward his former master. In wild-eyed panic, the white-braided Morint flinched back, stepping unconsciously and fatally out of the protection of the circle and star drawn upon the ground. The demon smiled then, a chilling smile, bent and caught the shrieking magician by each ankle, ignoring the blows rained on his head and shoulders by the skull-topped staff. Then the monster stood up, lifting the struggling man to hang upside down by the legs. The huge shoulders surged with an awful power, and leering hideously, the devil deliberately and with a cruel slowness tore the magician in two. The Morindim fled. Contemptuously, the immense devil hurled the chunks of his former master after them, spattering the grass with blood and worse. Then, with a savage hunting cry, he leaped in pursuit of them. The three-eyed Ogrenja had stood, still locked in a half-crouch, watching the destruction of the white-braided Morind almost with indifference. When it was over, he turned to cast eyes burning with hatred upon Belgariad. The old sorcerer, drenched with sweat, raised his skull-staff in front of him, his face set with extreme concentration. The interior struggle rippled more intensely within the form of the monster, but gradually Belgariad's will mastered and solidified the shape. Ogrenja howled in frustration, clawing at the air until all hint of shifting or changing was gone. Then the dreadful hands dropped, and the monster's head bowed in defeat. "Begone," Belgariad commanded almost negligently, and Ogrenja instantly vanished. Garion suddenly began to tremble violently. His stomach heaved. He turned, tottered a few feet away, and fell to his knees and began to retch. "What happened?" Silk demanded in a shaking voice. "It got away from him," Belgariad replied calmly. "I think it was the blood that did it." When he saw that Ogrenja was bleeding, and that Horja was not, he realized that he had forgotten something. That shook his confidence, and he lost his concentration. "Garion, stop that."
"I can't,"
Garion groaned, his stomach heaving violently again. "How long
Will Horja chase the others? Until the sun goes down. I imagine that the Weasel clan is in for a bad afternoon.
Is there any chance that he will turn around and come after us?
He has no reason to. We did not try to enslave him. As soon as Gerion gets his stomach under control again, we can go on. We won't be bothered anymore.
Gerion stumbled to his feet, weakly wiping at his mouth.
Are you all right?
Not really, but there's nothing left to come up.
Get a drink of water. Try not to think about it.
Will you have to do that anymore? Silk asked, his eyes a bit wild.
No,
Belgariad pointed. There were several riders along the crest of a hill, perhaps a mile away.
The other Morindom in the area watched the whole thing. The word will spread, and nobody will come anywhere near us now. Let's mount up and get going. It is still a very long way to the coast.
In bits and pieces, as they rode for the next several days, Gerion picked up as much information as he really wanted about the dreadful contest that he had witnessed.
It is the shape that's the key to the whole thing, Belgariad concluded. What the Morindom call devil spirits don't look that much different from humans. You form an illusion drawn out of your imagination and force the spirit into it. As long as you can keep it locked up in that illusion, it has to do what you tell it to. If the illusion falters for any reason, the spirit breaks free and resumes its real form. After that, you have no control over it whatsoever. I have a certain advantage in these matters. Changing back and forth from a man to a wolf has sharpened my imagination a bit.
Why did Belden say that you were a bad magician, then? Silk asked curiously.
Belden's a purist, the old man shrugged. He feels that it's necessary to get everything into the shape, down to the last scale and toenail. It isn't really, but he feels that way about it.
Do you suppose we could talk about something else? Gerion asked. They reached the coastline a day or so later. The sky had remained overcast, and the sea of the east lay sullen and rolling under dirty gray clouds. The beach along which they rode was a broad shingle of black round stones littered with chunks of white bleached driftwood. Waves rolled, foaming up the beach, only to slither back with an endless, mournful sigh. Seabirds hung in the stiff breeze, screaming at them. "Which way?" Silk asked. Belgariad looked around.
"North,"
he replied. "How far?"
"I'm not positive. It's been a long time, and I can't be sure exactly where we are."
"You're not the best guide in the world, old friend," Silk complained.
"Yes, you can't have everything."
They reached the land bridge 2 days later, and Gerion stared at it in dismay. It was not at all what he had expected, but consisted of a series of round, wave-eroded white boulders sticking up out of the dark water and running in an irregular line off toward a dark smudge on the horizon. The wind was blowing out of the north, carrying with it a bitter chill and the smell of polar ice. Patches of white froth stretched from boulder to boulder as the swells ripped themselves to tatters on the submerged reefs. "How are we supposed to cross that?" Silk objected.
"We wait until low tide," Belgariad explained. "The reefs are mostly out of the water then."
"Mostly?"
"We might have to wade a bit from time to time. Let's strip these furs off our clothes before we start. It will give us something to do while we're waiting for the tide to turn. And they are starting to get a bit, fragrant."
They took shelter behind a pile of driftwood far up on the beach and removed the stiff, smelly furs from their clothing. Then they dug food out of their packs and ate. Gerion noted that the stain that had darkened the skin on his hands had begun to wear thin, and that the tattoo drawings on the faces of his companions had grown noticeably fainter. It grew darker, and the period of twilight that separated one day from the next seemed longer than it had no more than a week ago.
"Summer is nearly over up here,"
Belgariad noted,
looking out at the boulders gradually emerging from the receding water in the murky twilight.
"How much longer before low tide?" Sulk asked.
"Another hour or so."
They waited. The wind pushed at the pile of driftwood erratically and brushed the tall grass along the upper edge of the beach, bending and tossing it. Finally, Belgariad stood up.
"Let's go," he said shortly. "We will lead the horses. The reefs are slippery, so be careful how you set your feet down."
The passage along the reef between the first stepping stones was not all that bad, but once they moved farther out, the wind became a definite factor. They were frequently drenched with stinging spray, and every so often a wave, larger than the others, broke over the top of the reef and swirled about their legs, tugging at them. The water was brutally cold.
"Do you think that we'll be able to make it all the way across before the tide comes back in?"
Sulk shouted over the noise.
"No," Belgariad shouted back. "We'll have to sit it out on top of one of the larger rocks."
"That sounds unpleasant."
"Not nearly as unpleasant as swimming."
They were perhaps halfway across when it became evident that the tide had turned. Waves more and more frequently broke across the top of the reef, and one particularly large one pulled the legs of Gerion's horse out from under him. Gerion struggled to get the frightened animal up again, pulling at the reins as the horse's hoofs scrambled and slid on the slippery rocks of the reef. "We'd better find a place to stop, grandfather," he yelled above the crash of the waves. "We'll be neck-deep in this before long."
"2 more islands," Belgariad told him. "There's a bigger one up ahead."
The last stretch of the reef was completely submerged, and Gerion flinched as he stepped down into the icy water. The breaking waves covered the surface with froth, making it impossible to see the bottom. He moved along blindly, probing the unseen path with numb feet. A large wave swelled and rose up as far as his armpits, and its powerful surge swept him off his feet. He clung to the reins of his horse, floundering and sputtering as he fought to get back up. And then they were past the worst of it. They moved along the reef with the water only ankle-deep now. A few moments later they climbed up onto the large white boulder. Gerion let out a long, explosive breath as he reached safety. The wind blowing against his wet clothing chilled him to the bone, but at least they were out of the water. Later, as they sat huddled together on the leeward side of the boulder, Gerion looked out across the sullen black sea toward the low, forbidding coastline lying ahead. The beaches, like those of Morinland behind them, were black gravel, and the low hills behind them were dark under the scudding gray cloud. Nowhere was there any sign of life, but there was an implicit threat in the very shape of the land itself. "Is that it?" he asked finally in a hushed voice. Belgariad's face was unreadable as he gazed across the open water toward the coast ahead.
"Yes," he replied.
"That is Meloria."